This podcast is brought to you by PC component retailer and boutique builder Silverknight PCs. Use offer code BrokenSilicon to get 6% off everything on their website. And it is also brought to you by healthy and delicious Vite Ramen. And it is also brought to you by CDKeyOffer.com that gets you great deals on Windows keys and other products. You can find links in the description and the proper offer codes for all of these sponsors, and we'll talk about them later. But for now, let's just get on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I am joined actually from when we usually record this, you try to fix the focus on your camera.
Goes out of autofocus immediately today.
And what they also don't know is I almost fell out of my chair when I started recording too, which actually at that point, I think we just leave it in. Leave in, you're out of focus, and I just fall out of my chair and we start. Why not? Yeah. But yet, usually we would record 3 days ago, at least.
Yeah.
And we just decided because the RTX 4070 was getting its reviews on Wednesday that, we could push it up or do that thing we sometimes do where we actually release the episode a day early so it's not next to big news. But it's also Easter weekend. And so, I don't know, just let us spend Sunday with our families, and trying to make sure this is a well-rounded episode, which, of course, there's a loose ends on Monday anyways for those who want hours of me rambling. But now you're here to join me rambling today, Dan. Rambling. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good, I suppose, yeah.
I'm pretty good. There's been a lot of, which we'll get to, leaks out of Moore's Law is Dead about Zen 5 and other stuff in the past couple of weeks. And I got to say that there's always this worry when we wait or push back an episode that it will be for nothing. Because I had literally a couple websites sent me RTX 4070 reviews a couple days ago. I was like, maybe we could record Monday and try to have this drop when the reviews are out. But for me, the most interesting thing about the RTX 4070 is how people react to it. And I won't know that until review day because I think we knew the performance, but I got to say, I'm not disappointed we pushed this back. The reactions have been interesting so far. And I've actually got some new information about 4070 supply and even new Zen 5 info again for this episode, new Meteor Lake info. So we'll get to that. But first, let me do an opening reader mail here. My boy writes in and says, my boy, speaking of himself in the third person, oddly, is now listening to the Sahara Intox EP prologue, which is the song, by the way, used for the Broken Silicon intro again and again and again and again and again. And I think he says again about 40 times, so I'm not going to read that. But what that is to say, he said again a lot in his reader mail. He says, don't listen to Moore's Law is Dead. He brainwashes his viewers into becoming addicted to Sahara's music. Well,
that's the point.
I wouldn't have chosen Sahara if I didn't think their music was freaking great. And actually, funnily enough, their SoundCloud website or link is called Sahara Sucks. So if you want to go check out their music, it's on SoundCloud. But don't forget to also just Google around. There's also some old rap band called Sahara. This is a more modern alternative band that has a Bandcamp and I think another page as well to get all of their music because they actually have 10 or 20 songs. And we actually got to look in more places than just their SoundCloud. Check out their YouTube channel as well. But speaking of music, there's other music that I would like to recommend. If you go to the Moore's Law is Dead Twitter and just scroll down a little bit, I retweeted Gerard's new album. So Gerard is in a band called Sotrack. It's a Catalan band in Spain. So I don't even know if I said the name of their band correctly, but I believe I did. It's Sotrack, and they have a album that came out I believe today. So check that out because it isn't in English to my understanding, or at least most of it doesn't seem to be, but it sounds really good. And I shouldn't say that I'm surprised, but I never know what I'm going to get. Not only is the album really good, but it also is like my taste in music, and so I can't recommend it enough. There'll be a link in the description to their song Heroes, and their band name is SOTRAC. Check them out on Spotify. Just, Gerard's our audio engineer. I think at a minimum he should get a shout out for his band when they put out an album, for working with us so much.
Yeah, I mean, he does a lot of good work for this channel, and I have not checked out his album yet, but I will.
And
or his band's album.
You're a very bad person for not checking it.
I know.
Yeah. He did use AI generation for the music videos too, so those are pretty cool. So again, links in the description. SOTRAC. And now let us get to the corrections. Bullethead writes in, and he says, "Hey Tom, here's an update on Dreams." And he's linking to an article here from Polygon, quoting, "We've made the difficult decision to discontinue live support for Dreams after the 1st of September 2023. Okay, so this was recent news that I must have missed. To shift our focus to an exciting new project, the studio said in a blog post, the title won't be removed from sale, and players will still be able to create, share, and play within Dreams, but there won't be any more updates or developer-led events such as the Impy Awards that rewarded the community's best creations, nor will we be following through on the long-promised multiplayer support. And the game won't be updated for PlayStation 5 or PlayStation VR 2. Dreams will also be migrated to a new server in late May, after which players will face a storage limit of 5 gigabytes for new creations in an effort to preserve the security and stability of the Dream server. Translation, they don't want to pay for large servers for this game. Yeah. Existing creations uploaded before the move won't count towards the limit. The number of other features will be removed from the game, including Twitch integration." So yeah, I don't remember which podcast it was. I mean, I think I made fun of it on news episodes with you before. But,
probably, yeah.
Recently, I don't know if it was Brian Heemskirk or I think it was the Unreal Engine 5 developers, at least one of them. I made a joke that like nothing happened to that game, and well, I guess there you go. If you've been listening to Sacred Symbols, they've been making fun of that. Maybe not making fun of that, but pointing out consistently that this game clearly didn't know what it wanted to be and was going nowhere for years. And I guess it's officially gone nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, they plugged that. I mean, they first showed off that game when the PS4 was announced. And I know it's been out to some
announcement.
I know it's been out in some form for a few years now, but it kind of felt like it was a game that never really left alpha or beta, even though if it nominally did. Like there was that weird thing, if you'll remember, where at one point they were saying we'll only sell a limited number of copies of Dreams, which was bizarre. And I don't know. Media Molecule was like, they made Little Big Planet, which is a fantastic game, but
we have very fond memories of playing that decades ago. Yeah.
But beyond that, it's just, yeah, they never took off past Little Big Planet. And, I don't want to say the studio's probably at death's door, but if they don't have a good project after this, I don't know what's going on with them.
Look, to be fair, they're an indie studio. My memory tells me that they're not really anymore, but my memory tells me that the original Little Big Planet was made with a team of like 25 people. And obviously they got bigger after that, and Tearaway was well received, but unfortunately first released on the Vita, which Sony hated that console and wanted it to die in the crib. But what I don't understand is, for a company that at least on paper and financially seems to be good at stewarding studios, I don't know how they let them go this long doing nothing with this IP. Like, they could have been working on so many other games.
I mean, I guess from Sony's perspective, like, they are like 10 plus times smaller than like the majority of their other studios that they own. So having them fumble around a bit more is probably less problematic versus like if Naughty Dog or something were fumbling around for 10 years, because Naughty Dog employs what? Probably, I don't know the exact size of the studio, but I would assume like
it's a very large studio. And at least so far, plus. No matter what happens, even if Factions comes out probably 3 years late, it's going to be a seller.
And if they get Factions out this year, I mean, that's still 4 games in 10 years from Naughty Dog. That's not really bad.
No, it's not. But it does make you wonder, like, at least the rumors I've heard from out of people that either work at or connected to like Xbox studios is that Bethesda's kind of at death's door if Starfield doesn't go well, and that they're already like have a microscope over them all of a sudden, and that 343 is basically gutted by now. And it's because eventually Microsoft said, hey, we gave you all this money. What are you doing with it? And I guess I don't know. I don't know what it costs Sony to keep the studio going, but Sony has, and I think sometimes unfairly with studios like Zipper, killed them off if they didn't deliver. And I don't know. I guess, as someone who's a fan of SOCOM, why did you kill Zipper, Sony? And then the Media Molecule can just putz around for years here with this. I don't know. It's just, in comparison, annoying to me.
The reason is I would assume, is that they're a way smaller studio, so they can probably get away with not making money for longer than other studios. Because, like, if not, like I said, if Naughty Dog went 10 years without making a successful game, that would be a pretty big deal. But Media Molecule is only like 50 people as it stands right now, so I wouldn't be surprised if they're still living off of Tearaway doing relatively well. And who knows, maybe Dreams somehow miraculously turned a small profit. I doubt it, but you never know.
I think I would bet money it did not. But Pigeon writes in and says, hi, Tom. In your AMD Zen 5 leak video, you compared the current AMD versus Intel CPU situation to NVIDIA versus Radeon a decade ago. Except the period you pointed out on the market share graph is nearly 2 decades ago, just something to make you feel old. Which I looked this up and I was like, is that correct? And it is. Yeah, I guess it is. Technically, when AMD had over 50% market share with NVIDIA, at least according to most estimates, I guess that was actually, I think, right before and during the 3870 period. Mm-hmm. My memory always just was that like Fermi is when NVIDIA started to get to 50% market share above. But I guess I was maybe off a gen in my memory. Having said that, Pigeon, I will say that whole period that I argue AMD is doing to Intel right now of technically having less market share, but making double the margins of Intel, and thus over time having more money for R&D, being more financially healthy. And eventually, by the time you get to 50% market share, you're making tons more money, and the other companies screwed. That's what I'm worried is happening between AMD and Intel now. That is what happened with NVIDIA to Radeon, but that process it was like 2005 to 2015. And I think the first architecture became abundantly obvious it was Fury, where AMD had to use HBM.
Yeah.
And they were on their bazillionth generation of GCN with the massive memory bandwidth and a huge die. And NVIDIA was launching this GDDR5 generation that had the same efficiency. That was crazy. And that's because they had the money to spend on a advanced architecture, whereas AMD was just updating GCN ad nauseum for years.
Yeah, and you could really tell with the Fury series of cards, they were pretty decent cards, I think, but you could tell there was something going on with AMD because that they should have had 8 gigs of RAM in comparison to the rest of their lineup, at least.
At least the top card should have. And they, I think there's a big misconception. Technically the most efficient card out of the Maxwell versus, what was it? The 300 series generation is the Fury Nano. That was the most efficient card. Mm-hmm. And people misremember that the Fury X was some hulking beast. He's the same energy as a 980 Ti. Same. But it did require liquid cooling for the HBM, or it kind of did. It was on the borderline. They decided to go with it. And their memory controller used so much less energy than Maxwell, and yet overall they used the same amount of energy. So it wasn't wow, they've tied Maxwell with something that costs 20 to 30% more to make. It's almost like AMD needs a new architecture finally.
Well, and then we putzed around for 5 more years and got a decent Vega architecture, and then got RDNA, which is actually undeniably pretty good at this point.
Right, and RDNA launched 2019, and then RDNA 2 was 2020. So that would have been, that's interesting though. Those would have both been started before Zen 2, before Zen 1, I mean, even launched and brought a bunch of money into AMD. But it still has to help that like halfway through development, I'm sure Radeon just got double the funding.
Yeah.
That had to have helped somewhat there though. Taylor Hayden writes in and says, "Hi, Tom. In your conversation last week with the anonymous Unreal Engine 5 developer, I think some aspects of why games can demand a quarter of the game to be loaded at a time didn't quite get communicated correctly. You mentioned that the game needs to cache the results of how different materials interact with lighting, where 1,000 textures become tens of thousands because of different levels of lighting and shadows being placed onto the textures and then stored in RAM. That's not really correct. Assets in memory will be larger than assets on disk. Textures, audio, animations will be compressed in storage and loaded into memory. They're either completely uncompressed or the compression ratio is notably worse. Additionally, runtime effects can place significant demands on memory. Ray tracing requires a BV8 structure to be maintained. Voxel-based GI solutions require voxel grids to be located on the GPU, and asynchronous compute workloads require their own GPU memory buffers. Even bog standard effects like real-time shadow maps require GPU memory that is not part of a game bundle. So at a minimum, I vastly oversimplified why we need more VRAM on a GPU. But yes, thank you for the correction. And we will actually talk more about the VRAM discussion soon. But let us first start with a GPU that already does not have that much VRAM for the generation it's in, with story number 1, RTX 4070 review discussion and launch day supply leak. All right, so I have the write-up and then I will get your thoughts, Dan. So here we are, finally at the beginning, at the launch of NVIDIA's first mid-range Lovelace card. Although that word, mid-range, is the word that needs to be focused on here. Because today, NVIDIA decided that a 295 millimeter squared 104 die that is cut down by 24%, roughly the same amount cut down as the 3060 Ti, should cost $600 or more. Now, a week ago, this channel warned that while NVIDIA had shoved a loss leader MSRP down AIB's throats, the specs still don't lie. The 4070 would cost $600 because this 29 teraflop card was going to be a lot weaker than the 40 teraflop RTX 4070 Ti. And if we average the results of the tech power-up and hardware and box numbers from today, at least when I averaged them, I found the 4070 is 19% weaker than the 4070 Ti. The 4070 is 17% weaker than the 16 gigabyte 6950 XT, and the 4070 ties the 16 gigabyte 6800 XT and actually loses to the 3080 slightly. The 4070 is also, at least in this reader's opinion, most notably only 13% faster than the 16 gigabyte RX 6800. And that is the most notable thing here, at least in my opinion, because that card has more RAM than the 4070 and costs 20% less. And of course, if that's not the card you want to get, which that's really the mid-range card I think you should be considering if you want to save money, the stronger 6950 XT, again, a card that is that the 4070 is 17% weaker than, and it costs about the same. And the 6800 XT costs 10% less for the same performance and more RAM. So truly, the only real saving grace of the 4070 is its efficiency, as it seems to only pull about 180 watts of power, which is around the same power consumption as the outgoing RTX 3060 Ti, almost like this should be called the 4060 Ti. Anyways, what do reviewers think? Honestly, not great things based on what I have seen. In summary, Hardware Unboxed seemed to give a mostly positive review, but it was really only barely mostly positive from what I could tell. Gamers Nexus seems to have ended up recommending the 6950 XT. Linus Tech Tips seems to recommend RDNA 2 cards like the 6950 XT or 6800 XT and was very disappointed. And Jay's 2 cents said, meh, it's basically priced like the rest of Lovelace. Paul's Hardware then focused on how bad the pricing was, pointing out how basically every previous Gen 70 card beat the previous gen before that 80 card by at least 10 or 20%, whereas this generation, it loses. And indeed, the community, or at least the vocal part that bothered to comment on YouTube, seems to hate this card. And again, I just want to summarize this. In the Hardware Unbox comments section, I saw a lot of hate for the 4070. In the Gamers Nexus comments section, I saw multiple people saying this is clearly a 4060 Ti that should be $450. And a substantial amount of people in the Linus Tech Tips section said, I just pulled the trigger on either a 7900 XT or 6950 XT. People in the Jay's 2 cents comment section hate it. And then people in the Paul's Hardware comments section also seem to hate the 4070. And so really, what else is there to say? Well, I guess the only thing then I will add after summarizing all of that info is that I do have final updates to 4070 launch day volume. So one source tells me that literally half of the 4070s loaded in their system are at MSRP. Listeners, would be good to remember that I leaked that NVIDIA was mandating that AIBs ship half of their initial volume at MSRP. I am told it is literally to the card half in the system right now, which is hilarious to me. AIBs don't seem to want to sell one card above MSRP that they don't have to. And overall, the average price seems to be around $631 for a 4070, although that price is a little misleading because the median is also $630, meaning half are $600 and the other half are not $630. They're more like $650 to $700. And then another source tells me that it's still early. This was from a large US retailer that says that they have more supply than the 4080 at launch, but less than the 4090. Another large online retailer tells me that they have more cards than most of the previous launches from Lovelace, but not as many as the 4090 and 7900 XT. So it's going to be a big launch, but not an insane one. Then another retailer outside the US told me that this will be a bigger launch than most gens, but it does not seem to be as big as a few recent ones. So I guess there you go. Half of the cards will be MSRP at launch. The other half definitely will not be. And there seems to be decent supply. I guess if people don't like this card, it'll be very easy to get then.
Well, this is supposed to be their volume product, so you would hope for decent
supply.
But
it doesn't seem to be as high volume as the 4090, at least at first. But all right, I just yammered on there, Dan. What do you think of the 4070?
I mean, the 4070 boldly brought $600 tier performance. I mean, no, $550 tier performance to $600 if you're comparing it to like the 6800 XT, which it's basically a 6800 XT.
With less RAM.
With less RAM and is better at ray tracing. Oh, not really that much
it's better at ray tracing. I think you can say it is, but yeah, a lot of games you won't turn it on because they'll run out of RAM.
Yeah, and also has DLSS, which I once again think DLSS is more of a selling point than the ray tracing. But so I mean, based on the environment right now, I think the 6800 XT is probably just a better buy if you're looking for a new card in this price range. I mean, DLSS continues to be a good feature, so I think maybe if DLSS keeps getting widely adopted, maybe it could swing into the 4070 being the better card to get at roughly the same price, but I don't know. Then it's counterbalanced by the RAM, and I'm not sure when 12 gigabytes are going to start being an issue, but it wouldn't surprise me if it became an issue in 4K over the next couple of years, which this isn't really being advertised as a 4K card, I guess, but you can play games in 4K with the amount of graphics power you have. It's just if the RAM is going to become an issue or not.
Yeah, I mean, and I undoubtedly bet that there are some people in the comments listening / watching this going, why did he show 4K benchmarks? Because it's fucking $600. That's why. It's fucking $600, you guys. And if you tell me you shouldn't expect to be able to run games in 4K without a stutter fest because you're running out of RAM with a $600 card, you're gone, you're brainwashed. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it's just getting to a point where it's like we're just at this point, I feel like, where 4K has been like the highest resolution in gaming, or that most people really discuss as a reasonable resolution to play in gaming for like the past decade. And I just seems that like the prices for what they call 1440p gaming and 1080p gaming, while you would expect them to decrease over time, it seems like they're slowly creeping up to the point where it's like, oh, great, a $600 card is our 1440p cards now. We did it. We made things more expensive, even though it's paradoxically using less silicon.
Yeah. Which, again, let's be clear about this. I think some people get a little too wrapped up in the die size argument. It's a fair argument with context, but you got to keep that context. Like 4 nanometer, I think costs about twice as much as what NVIDIA paid for 8 nanometer with Samsung. Not to say that we should care about that completely. I mean, so what?
Yeah.
Like, consumer before companies. I don't own any stocks in NVIDIA, so I don't really care what their margins are ultimately. But there is an honest discussion here of like, they don't want their margins to be cut in half. So, okay, you have a 400 millimeter squared 3070, and then you have a 300 basically millimeter squared 4070, but it costs twice as much. All right, so the silicon difference cost is maybe 20 to 50 bucks. It would make sense if this was like 550 or something, maybe. But at the end of the day, these are also the worst yields. And these are also cheaper boards than the 3070 because it requires less power draw. I mean, a lot of that silicon cost saving with Samsung was wiped out by the fact that they needed way better power components to control the voltage spikes of Samsung's like just node that was not meant to make big dies. And so, I mean, it really works out to, look, this is really what should be the 4060 Ti. The 3060 Ti was launched for 400. Then I'm giving NVIDIA a mulligan by saying this can be 500. I'm adding $100 to account for the silicon costs and RAM. But that's what it is. It is cut down basically the same amount as the 3060 Ti. That's what this is. It performs like what a 4060 Ti would be.
Yeah, they're calling their 60 Ti a 70 now, and they're pricing it in between their previous 70 and 80 cards, and it's just even though to some extent, I guess this does represent the best value NVIDIA has offered so far in the entire Lovelace lineup. It's hard to be excited about that when the value versus MSRPs from 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago at this point, is a $100 increase in price, benefit and price performance. Because like the 3080 is basically this card, the 4070, and that cost $700 2.5 years ago, and now we have a $600 card. It's just not that impressive. I mean, I guess now we have a marginal benefit in price performance versus last gen, but I think it's still marginal. And when you're looking at the other cards they've released, it's just flat out been the same. So congrats on that, I guess. And then the efficiency on it is good. But other than that, the 4070 is just it's just like you've discussed in the past. It's not giving you anything you couldn't get before. So it's kind of hard to be excited about it. And I guess it's slightly less RAM deficient than the equally powered cards from last gen. But still, that's not that much of an argument when you only have 12 gigs at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, if I'm just like doing some math on a little calculator, the 4070 Ti, which people seem to really not like, at least based on how many NVIDIA shipped and they just sat on store shelves, and basically more models than AIBs wanted to were pushed towards MSRP. I mean, the 4070 Ti, based on the benchmarks I'm looking at here, is only 20% weaker than the 4080, and yet it is 33% cheaper. Okay, well, the 4070 is 19% weaker than the 4070 Ti, and it's 25% cheaper. This is a worse movement than the 4080 to 4070 Ti, guys.
Yeah, I guess it almost looks better just because, like, I think for the level of performance you're getting, the 12 gigabytes seems less deficient, but yeah, it's really not that great of value.
And ultimately, that's my point is, and the point I made in that video I put out a week ago, or was it a week ago? I think it was about a week or two ago, where the 4070 truth leak, where I said, look, it is 600, but it is weaker than you wanted. It isn't almost a 4070 Ti. This thing's crazy cut down. And there are remote scenarios where the 4070 with just an 8-pin loses by more than a couple percentage points. It's usually just a couple percent, but it is sometimes more than that because in games that have the extra power headroom to boost higher on the 16-pin models, they can't on the 8-pin. So I guess what were you expecting out of reviews though, Dan? And this is what I was alluding to earlier. Like, this is what I wanted to see. How do people react to this? They're more negative than I expected.
I was expecting a relatively lukewarm reaction because it's just not that exciting of a card, in my opinion. And it depends on what angle you want to take from it. You can see it as this isn't really changing the market that much, so who cares? Or you can see it as this isn't really changing the market that much and being mad about it because it's not really improving anything, you know? Mm. So, I mean, it just depends on the angle or your perspective on how you view the product launches. Like, if you get mad seeing the needle not move, then yeah, I assume people that have that response are going to be pissed off about this because, yeah, this certainly isn't moving the needle on anything.
Mm-hmm. This is not any different than what NVIDIA has been doing with the rest of the Lovelace lineup and pricing.
Yeah.
And I guess we'll see, you know, this will drop, or we're recording this before sales go live. So we won't know how well this sells until this podcast is out. And I'll just say, my understanding is, depending on the retailer, they have more supply than the 4080, maybe comparable to the 4070 Ti or a little more, but not as many as the 4090 and 7900 XT, which the 7900 XT always had tons of supply for the price it was, especially. And so if this sells out on day one, I think NVIDIA knows that they can let AIBs raise prices, or they don't have to mandate half of it is at MSRP anymore. They'll go, oh, it's sold out? Okay, well, we'll just let AIBs sell for 700 de facto. And if it doesn't, I don't know. I've had some retailers say, at least the day before it's launching, there's not a lot of people calling about it. This could be a reckoning. And when you're watching this, when this comes out, if there's tons of 4070s still in stock, this isn't what NVIDIA wanted, and they supplied a decent amount of cards. If there's not, expect prices to go up because, as I leaked in the live stream earlier this week, NVIDIA is helping with the pricing on the initial shipments of 4070s with AIBs to make up for their last-minute price drop shenanigans. But it's temporary, and NVIDIA a lot of these prices will easily go back up if it sells out. And yeah, I guess we'll see, right?
I mean, like I said earlier, this is supposed to be their volume product, and this will just answer the question. What is the maximum price? Like the it's hard to say. Like the person that's DIYing is probably almost by definition more into this type of thing than PC hardware than most people are, obviously. But like this tests, will people be convinced that don't want to spend an arm and a leg on their PC? Will they be willing to spend $600, or are they just going to say, nope, I'm sitting this out, I'll wait for something that's like $300 or $400 to come out? Because, you know, that's what those consumers used to expect. And once you're into the solidly in the mid-range, honestly, arguably getting to low end if we're looking at graphics card releases, I think those people are less willing to budge on price.
Absolutely. This Easter season, Jesse isn't looking for any colorful eggs hidden by creepy man-sized rabbits. No, she's usually looking for new tennis balls at the park or for where my friend's dog is hiding around the house. Me, myself, usually during the spring season, I'd be hunting for the best way to avoid paying monopolistic prices for Microsoft software. Well, that was until I was sponsored by CDKeyOffer.com many years ago. This piece of content is brought to you by CDKeyOffer.com, CDKeyOffer.com, a long-term sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead for a reason. They've been good to me, they've been good to Dan, and they've been easy to work with. And they keep reliably providing the Moore's Law is Dead community with a product that I think PC gaming just needs. In a world where all of our components seem to keep getting more expensive, I don't think we should also have to be milked by Microsoft as well. So this Easter season, whether you're looking for Steam, EA, Uplay, or PlayStation keys, or Microsoft products as well, go to CDKeyOffer.com and use the offer code BrokenSilicon for 25% off all Microsoft products, and then Die Shrink for 3% off everything else on the website. Support Moore's Law is Dead by supporting CDKeyOffer.com this Easter season. And somewhat on this subject, Weirdface writes in, and he says, seems like the average gamer base is split on the 4070 in terms of their reactions. One side thinks the 4070 is just a 3070 Ti with 3070 Ti pricing, but with lower power draw now, and you should ignore it. The other side thinks the 4070 is a good deal and people should jump all over it. I think people who buy 12 gigabyte GPUs for $600 in order to game in 4K with max settings deserve the performance tanks they're going to get, though, in a year. Just get a 6800 XT instead, or a 6950 XT or 7900 XT instead of the 4070 Ti. You'll thank me later. Yeah, this was kind of a last-minute submission here, but this is the only reader mail we got about the 4070. I mean, people had hours. So I'm just saying it. I don't think there's the interest for this card NVIDIA thought there would be.
Yeah, because I don't know who the card is really for. It's $600. $600 for a graphics card. I know we've talked about it before, and like the market's changing, obviously. But $600 is definitely in the tier of where people consider it like close to enthusiast level pricing. Like, this is a thing that a hobby I'm willing to spend a lot of money on. And when you have people that are just that don't care as much, and they, you know, they're fair weather PC people, and they're like, well, screw this, I'll get a console, or screw this, I'll just keep using my 3060 Ti or 3070 even. There's just no one that this thing is for at $600, because you're charging high-end prices for a lower mid-range card.
Yeah, and I just decided while you were talking there to double check the r/NVIDIA subreddit, and I don't know, I checked a couple posts. It's not like I looked exhaustively, but mostly they think it sucks what I saw there in the NVIDIA subreddit. So at the end of the day, you can get something, and look, DLSS is a real thing here. I think because of DLSS, and to a much lesser extent, but I guess we'll put an asterisk for it, also because of the ray tracing advantage, at least in raw performance, although VRAM is an issue. I'd say for the same amount of performance in VRAM, if you had an NVIDIA card here and an AMD card here, I'd probably pay an extra 10 to 20% for NVIDIA because of DLSS and ray tracing. Mm-hmm. But that's it, because I think, you know, AMD has Radeon Chill. I think their driver software is slicker to use, easier to use, less buggy, less slow. Wattman is nice. AMD does have their own driver advantages. So it's not like NVIDIA software is just better. There are AMD advantages. Just DLSS and ray tracing is unignorably more important to me. And because of that, I'd maybe pay 10 to 20% more. But then when you throw in VRAM, I don't know. And so when I look at the 6950 XT, that is basically $600 now all of a sudden. Wonder why.
Yeah.
You know, it's like 17% stronger. That negates the DLSS point I made. That's the buffer I would want to see for the same price for performance. And then it has more RAM. And it's more important here. We're not talking like 20 gigabytes to 24 or something. This is a buffer that's already being filled up in 1440p in multiple games, 12 gigabytes. So I would recommend the 6950 XT over the 4070 if it's the same price. Certainly if it's cheaper. Although for the most part, I would, and it's not always this price, but I would tell people to look for a $450 6800, because that's like 30% weaker than a 6950 XT, yes. But if it's over 30% cheaper, you still get 16 gigabytes of RAM. I think that card's going to age very, very, very well for the price at $450. So there you go. I would just recommend that. And it's like the most efficient card in the AMD lineup. It's like a 200-watt card while gaming. I mean, just get that. 2H Freddy writes in and he says, with DLSS and FSR, there's often a lot of discussion about how many games support one or the other. But how many of those games with support would you actually want to use upscaling in? For me, basically all of them.
I mean, yeah, I can say that games that have FSR, I generally use it in.
Now you have a 6700 XT though, so you can usually benefit from that extra performance, obviously, right?
Yeah, and
you game in 4K, so like turning on FSR 2.0 quality, the 6700 XT. Am I wrong? Most of the time, that gets you to about 4K 100.
It depends on the game. I mean, like in modern, and like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, yeah, that gets me to about 90, 100 frames a second on average. And
with turned up settings, though, right?
Yeah, and with out upscaling, I'm not going to be playing. That would be like 60 frames per second ish.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's definitely a benefit. I know there are some resolution purists that will say, well, you're not technically gaming in 4K anymore. And it's like, yeah, I don't really care if the image still looks good, which I will say Call of Duty, and this is a problem with FSR in general, with like some of the lower quality settings, things do start to look a little bit janky. So I usually keep FSR at quality, because once you're into like the performance territory with FSR, I don't know, like in Call of Duty, like the shadows sometimes randomly turn blocky, and like in Deep Rock Galactic on performance mode, there's just tons of artifacts with FSR, but with FSR performance, but with quality that mostly goes away, and all I really see is an increase in frame rate.
But ultimately, it really depends. I think it goes this way. If you're an NVIDIA user, at least, like I say basically every game. I mean, DLSS at the highest quality setting in 4K, it doesn't look worse, or it sometimes even looks slightly better in some aspects. And so I just leave it on, if anything, to have better power consumption with my 4090, or, I mean, just to make sure it's always locked at 130 hertz instead of sometimes dipping. Like, I might as well. Mm-hmm. There's really no reason for you to not turn it on with DLSS. Even in 1080p, if you have a really weak card, I find it's serviceable. Whereas with the FSR, I find half the time you're making a sacrifice and you only turn that on in higher resolutions as an alternative to turning it down to 720p, because it usually does look better than turning it to 720p. Although in a lot of the latest games, like I do want to check here, because I know Hardware Unboxed just did a really good summary of like how, I want to make sure I'm not an idiot here. So he said DLSS looks significantly better in Harry Potter. That's interesting to me, not because I doubt it, but because I thought FSR 2.0, and maybe it's just because it's one of the first 2.0 games I've tried, looked okay in there. But I think it depends on the game as well, because there are some games now where the latest FSR in the latest releases is close to DLSS, but there's no way around it that if it's FSR 1, it just looks worse, especially compared to the latest version of DLSS.
Yeah, and I think with, I hope AMD keeps making improvements to FSR when like 3.0 comes out, and their 3.0 isn't just FSR 2.1 with whatever interpolation thing they're going to be doing. I would like to see
keep up. It can't be that. Yeah.
I would like to see benefits to the actual upscaling as well as the interpolation, which I'm still not super enthusiastic about. But
me either, not yet. Clean Sweep writes in and he says, "Hey Tom, Gamers Nexus recently covered the 3DFX Voodoo 5 6000 and the history of how 3DFX screwed over its AIB partners by building cards themselves. Given NVIDIA's recent burning of its own AIB partners like EVGA and frustrating them with these last-minute pricing changes, how many more generations of cards do we have before NVIDIA's AIBs either jump ship to AMD or maybe Intel?" Well, I'll just cut in here. AIBs fucking hate Intel, guys. Like, no. They were told by Intel to have their AIB coolers ready, like MSI, Asus. MSI was going to have a bunch of them. They did. They had them designed. They were told they needed to be ready for Q1, and they spent engineering resources designing these things. And then they were like, all right, when's it ready? And then Intel was like, oh, it's on shelves Q1 this summer. And then summer was going on, and they're like, why is only the A380 in China? When are we launching this? And then it ended up launching next to the 4090, and a lot of MSI, Asus, and other coolers I saw. Some that, I was told I couldn't leak, but I've seen some of these cooler designs, like from MSI, that they never came out because it was a waste of money. And every AIB I've talked to says Intel will have to have 2 good generations before we ever work with those a-holes again, because we spent all this money making these coolers and they didn't even launch it until like a year after they told us they would. So let's put it this way. AIBs will not be jumping ship to Intel.
Well, I mean, how many AIB models were even available? All I ever really
see. There's ASRock, and then
I'm looking at
Newegg just make one.
I'm looking at I see 2 AIB models and then the reference with the forever hilarious limited edition A770 still available to buy on Newegg.
Even though they made almost none of them. Yeah, I know. So anyways, continuing this question though, or will they just get out of the business like EVGA? With how NVIDIA GPUs dominate professional and AI tasks, I don't see them going out of business, but a decent chunk of NVIDIA's AIBs are just focused on making GPUs for consumers. There's one I have in mind that I could see going bankrupt or having issues with NVIDIA in the next couple of years. I'm not going to say which one, but I will say it's just one for now. It's not to say it couldn't become more, but at least you talk to people at Asus or, MSI. They're like, what do you want us to do? We got to work with NVIDIA. And some of them, I won't say which ones, have kind of talked like they don't really care, that they're like, some of them were almost like, whatever, EVGA, we can know how to run a business, even if you don't. So I don't know how much of that is just peacocking or bluster, but at least from what I'm hearing, they don't like what's going on all the time, but they don't feel like they have another choice. They will not be jumping to Intel. And while they would love to work with AMD more, they just don't see AMD as someone that's going to fill that volume. So they're not going to leave, guys.
And I think with EVGA being so heavily associated with NVIDIA as a brand, clearly something behind the scenes was happening, I think, that made it EVGA's situation uniquely bad.
There's, if I get into details, there were things I kind of heard behind the scenes that the head of EVGA had personal reasons for being frustrated with NVIDIA. Not to say they weren't legitimate reasons, but they were personal.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there was something more going on that made EVGA get out of it, because that's such a drastic move for a company like EVGA to not partner with NVIDIA anymore. And who knows, maybe that means we'll start seeing some AIBs leave them, but I doubt a significant number of them would.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyways, let us now then finally, this was the main story, but finally move on to story number 2. We need to talk about 8GB and 12GB graphics cards. And so I have a small write-up here. Recently, a lot of AAA releases have seen a requirement for 4K games requiring 12GB or more of VRAM, playing in 1440p requiring 10GB or more, and even 1080p often requiring at least 8GB for decent gaming. And according to a recent interview with Unreal Engine 5 developer who joined the last Broken Silicon, this issue is not going away. It seems that moving forward, according to this developer, and also according to probably the next guest from Infinity Ward and other developers I've talked to recently, it seems that moving forward, 8GB will be a low-end capacity. Honestly, kind of like how 4GB were in 2020, and how 12GB is now, for being honest, lower mid-range. And most likely 16GB will be a mid-range standard requirement for new AAA releases very soon. Now, that's not to say that 8GB GPUs will be useless in a year, but it is to say they will often be relegated to lower settings in a 1080p resolution if you want to play the latest AAA releases. Furthermore, Hardware Unboxed just did a very interesting test of the 6800 versus the 3070 years later. And he found that even if your game of choice on paper runs okay in 1440p on the 3070, it must be noted that a lot of these games that are using 7GB or more are loading PS3 textures to compensate for the VRAM buffer that is overworked. So celebrate those games using only 7.5 gigabytes of VRAM in 4K if you want, but you're probably loading 720p textures half of the time, and you've probably been doing that for years with your 3070 and didn't notice it. So yeah, I thought this was a very this deserved its own discussion because like we've already been talking about this. It's already become an issue. A lot of recent releases. A lot of people say they're unoptimized, but Hardware Unboxed found that if you just take like basically every game in the past year and average it, ray tracing is almost not a feature for the 3070 already. It's losing by larger margins than it did before to the 6800. And even in games where it's getting a similar frame rate to the 6800, 16 gigabyte, yeah, it's an on paper frame rate that's the same, but it's loading horrific textures to try to stay within the buffer. And you're getting a worse experience with these lower VRAM cards. So I don't know, Dan, what did you think about all of this?
I mean, I also think they noted that Hardware Unboxed noted that in their review for the 4070 that they now consider 8 gigabytes entry level, which I thought was interesting.
I agree.
That's what happens over time. I've had 8 gigabytes of RAM on my GPUs since 2015, and I spent, I think, like $350 for that 390 I bought, or 8 gigabytes plus, because now I have 12. But
you had an 8 gigabyte card that you paid like $300 to $350 for in 2015, people.
Yeah. So all I'm saying is for the past 8 years ish, I've had 8 gigs of RAM plus on my graphics cards. 8 gigabytes isn't a new thing. 8 gigabytes was clearly showing its age when Ampere came out. I don't really know what some people expect. Like, all of these specs increase over time, and for some reason they just expect games to be able to work with an 8 gigabyte buffer forever, even though, like, how much stronger have graphics cards gotten from a compute standpoint?
Yeah, I know.
Like, they, in that same amount of time, they've gone from what? The 390 is how many teraflops? Like, I mean, it's like a 10x.
No, but it's funny because I've looked at the teraflops of last gen consoles and then like the latest APUs. And I did this because I saw people after I kind of did that ad that was like a mini review for the Minis Forum 7735HS system. I think that was like a 3.5 teraflop 12 compute unit APU. And now the Phoenix system is probably going to be like 8 to 9 teraflops. And I'm like, oh, wow. So this is already double the PS4 Pro. We're getting to APUs that are more teraflops than high-end cards from 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And it's like, yeah, I don't know, guys. We need to, well, I guess it'd be like 8 years ago, but it's like 8 years ago, we had these APU teraflop graphics cards that had 8 gigabytes. Why would 8 gigabytes still be standard? There's no good argument. Like, this has just been cost-cutting stagnation.
Yeah, and like I remember when you bought the 3070 initially, that was like one of the things you were worried about was the fact that it had only 8 gigabytes of RAM, and you knew that would present an issue eventually, which you upgraded before it really became an issue for you. But yeah, I think anybody that was like looking at it honestly knew that, especially like cards like the 3070 were going to start having problems within a couple of years. And just this weird thing has happened where people want to see their hardware get better year over year for eternity, but for some reason they also think that having 8 gigs of RAM on it is fine in perpetuity. And actually a game using more than 8 gigs of RAM isn't a sign of the times changing. It's a sign of it being poorly optimized. Which,
right.
When 10 poorly optimized games come out in a row,
poorly optimized.
Yeah, I should say in quotes, poorly optimized games come out in a row that all use more than 8 gigabytes of RAM on ultra settings, maybe the times are changing. I know you can point to The Last of Us PC and say, well, that game was poorly optimized, and we all know it was. But the fact of the matter is that's not the only game that's using more than 8 gigs of RAM.
Well, and you were saying this to me offline, at the end of the day, what's your point? Are there not a lot of games coming out that your card doesn't have enough RAM for? You can scream, unoptimized and scratch at your eyes all you want, but it's still true. And you have this information that the game will not run on your card. Make whatever excuse you want. But ignoring it doesn't change the fact that those games are out there and will always be out there. And they seem very prevalent now. And it's not going to get better next year, according to every developer I talked to. I'm really excited for this Infinity Ward dev because he's basically just saying, no, like, you're going to need more. We're like, have fun playing the next Call of Duty in 720p, dude.
It reminds me, because like certain like Android phones have really, really good cameras and like just shitty camera apps. Yeah. And like there are people that will defend like those phones, like, and keep buying them out on principle because the camera is better than the iPhone. And it's like, I don't know, the iPhone maybe has a worse sensor, but guess what? Those iPhone pictures look a lot better than whatever piece of shit phone you're using, even if it has an 8 megapixel higher sensor or something like that. It's just, are you going to get a worse thing out of principle, or are you just going to accept that this is reality and get a card with more RAM if you want to play at 4K, or accept that you're going to be playing games in 1080p and 1440p because 8 gigs of RAM isn't enough at 1080p and 1440p anymore?
Well, and again, the thing that annoys me is people acting like this is some surprise this year. Like you said, in my 3070 review in early 2021 is when I did it. I hammered home that there were obvious examples of it already being an issue. Like, I went from a 16 gigabyte Radeon 7, again, a card that was $700 in 2019 with 16 gigabytes of RAM NVIDIA. And yes, the Radeon 7 was ultimately probably around the performance of like a 3060 or something. But, it could game in 4K half the time with the games I was playing, especially if they're a year old or more. And I found going from the, Radeon 7 to the 3070, which I guess from the previous generations, you would say that's like going from a 2080 performance to a 2080 Ti's level of performance. There were games where I had to turn down settings that were getting, I think in Resident Evil 2, I was getting 4K 100-ish on the Radeon 7. And so my monitor maxed out at the time, before I've overclocked it now, at 120 hertz. And so I didn't really need more frame rate, but I had to eventually turn it to 1440p with the 3070. And I noted that there are a lot of benchmarks online of Resident Evil 2 running okay on 8 gigabytes with the 3070 and 4K. But if you go for more than 30 minutes, you don't just run a benchmark. You play for 30 minutes and go to like the sewer area. Mm-hmm. There was nothing I could do with settings. I had to go to 1440p. I couldn't just turn down textures. And I was like, so here's a game that's a couple years old. Already I have to turn down settings in 4K to say gigabyte card. That was 2 years ago, guys. Like, you were warned. You were warned by me. You were warned by Hardware Unboxed. In the 3080 review, like, if you turned on ray tracing and played for an hour in Battlefield 5, the frame rate crashed because it was built for 11 gigabytes. So, I don't know. It was never allocation. There were multiple examples of 10 gigabytes not being enough for 4K and 8 gigabytes clearly barely being enough for 1440p years ago. This isn't new.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's like there's been you parked your car in a train track and like a freight train has slowly been approaching you for 2 years, and people are like, hey man, a freight train is going to be here. You need to move your car. And then the freight train finally hits your car and you're like, well, where the hell did this come from? Everybody warned you.
And again, I understand even for the past 3 years, there's been plenty of games that in 4K used only 6 gigabytes, only 5 gigabytes, whatever. But that's not like a third of the RAM. Like, most games were using over 6 gigabytes in 4K and even often in 1440p years ago. So add a couple years. Like, and again, the people that say these games are unoptimized, it's not like the other games are at 4 gigabytes. They're all at the limits.
Yeah, and it's not like I have doubt. I don't think any game will come out that runs in 4K with less than 8 gigs of RAM. Yeah, there will be some forever. I doubt it. You're going to see more and more AAA games over time use 8 gigabytes plus of RAM, though. Because guess what? Every new card that's coming out now has 8 plus gigs of RAM. Has more than 8 gigs of RAM. Their devs are going to start designing their games for that. And frankly, this is a big issue with PC in general. We all talk about how much better the PCs are than the consoles, but the consoles don't have shit I/O compared to the PC, which is making a difference.
For being able to move data around.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just thought this was worth pointing out, especially after that hardware unbox video and after talking to an Unreal Engine 5 developer, because it's not just that there's been like half a dozen games with issues with 8 and 12 gigabyte cards right now, but it's also that in the games that technically run, apparently they're loading 720p textures now. That means in a year, there's nothing you can do. So, I mean, just you've been warned. And I guess the last thing I'd want to say about this is if you're someone who's pissed off that your 3070 or 3070 Ti has run out of RAM, if your decision is, so I'll go from 8 gigabytes in 2021 to 12 gigabytes in 2023, you've learned nothing.
Unless you want to upgrade your card next generation, which it's fine if that's what you're doing, but I wouldn't buy a 12 gigabyte card and be like, think I'm going to be gaming in 4K for 4 years with that thing.
Me and Steve talked about this. 8 gigabyte cards should be under 300 now. 12 gigabyte cards should be under 400. That's it. Like, it's done.
Probably, yeah.
This piece of content is brought to you by Silverknight PCs. Silverknight PCs is a disabled, veteran-owned GPU and CPU retailer, PC repair shop, and boutique PC builder that is located in North Carolina, but ships globally. They do it all. If you are in the area, drop by their location at 1324 Bragg Boulevard in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to pick up reasonably priced components that come with up to a 3-year warranty, and you can even trade in parts for refurbishment as well. Or go to their website and use their new PC customization tool to put together the blueprints for your dream PC that they will be happy to consult with you on before building and shipping it to you. They're easy to talk to. The owner of the company even sat down and had a candid conversation with me during the pandemic shortages years ago. And so I know from firsthand experience that they do a good job. In fact, the RTX 4090 Supreme Liquid in my PC used to render this ad was sent to me by them after having its thermal paste and pads custom upgraded. So I know they ship high quality stuff, and whether you're in the Fayetteville area looking to buy a graphics card in person, or you want to custom order something from them online, or even shop on their eBay store, click the link in the description and use offer code BrokenSilicon to get 6% off all orders. This helps me a lot, this helps them, and I am genuinely happy to get their sponsorship, as they really are a business that I can stand by as genuinely reliable. Go to silverknightpcs.com and use offer code BrokenSilicon today. QH Freddy writes in and he says, we're seeing the introduction of 24 gigabit DDR5 dies recently on 12 and 24 gigabyte modules. Will we see these intermediate capacities at all on GDDR? Yes, I'm told that there's a 24 gigabit standard for the chips for GDDR7, and that NVIDIA is actually pretty mad those won't be ready for at least a year and a half from now, or for at least a couple years, because at least what I'm hearing from my NVIDIA contacts, they've basically been telegraphing to me that obviously we already basically know this, the 4060 is going to be an 8 gigabyte card. I've also been told the 5060 sounds like it's 128-bit, and therefore will also be a 8 gigabyte card. I actually leaked that in a recent video, and I've told them, then don't launch it.
Yeah,
like, 8 gigabytes in 2 years will not cut it for anything but a $150 card.
Because at 128 bits, at 128-bit, they could have 12 gigabytes, right, with that intermediate
Exactly. Yeah, they could put 12 gigabytes on a 128-bit card. Sounds good for $300 to me.
Yeah, which that can't come soon enough. Maybe with intermediate capacities, NVIDIA will be slightly less stingy with their RAM.
Well, yeah, because their plan is they want to keep the die as small as possible. I/O doesn't shrink with node size. And it also, if they use a smaller bus, allows them to fit a 4090 laptop card in previous gen, 2070, 2070, yeah. I mean, that's 2 gens ago, but, and it allows them to fit 4070 or, the 106 die in what would have usually only fit the 107 die. So that's why they want to do this. It allows them to take up less space on the board with less DRAM modules, but it sounds like in the low end, they might be screwed for a year or so. Yeah. We're going to have to see, because I think this is an evolving story where NVIDIA might have to reevaluate their decisions here. Mark writes in, he says, we've heard that I/O does not shrink when put on newer nodes, but what about the power to drive it? Monolithic to monolithic, does the memory interface on a graphics card with the same bus width require less energy at the same memory clock? Comparing, for example, if that I/O portion of the die was on 4 nanometer versus 6 nanometer, is the energy consumption of this component negligible? Anyways, no, it isn't. It uses actually quite a bit of energy in recent cards, relatively speaking. And does a 7 nanometer I/O die on Ryzen save power compared to a 14 nanometer one? Yes. And Mark, you should know that the reason my audio sound has slightly changed, and the reason that the people watching this podcast now have just a screenshot of an NVIDIA mobile graphics card on screen, is that although I did answer your question live during the initial recording with Dan, I think my answer was pretty good, but it wasn't perfect. And after the recording was done, I got input from a graphics card engineer at one of the major graphics card companies. And so, well, I thought I'd redo this question so I could get you guys the legit answer, because I think this is an important question Mark asks in relation to my recent content. So, well, from an actual graphics card engineer, the answer is, sadly, no. That 30% quote from TSMC for going from 5 nanometer to 3 nanometer is only for the core logic. I/O power improves along with the GDDR standard, though, and GDDR7 is lower power than GDDR6 per bit transferred. But that's mostly orthogonal from the GPU process. So, for example, Ampere and Lovelace running the same RAM have similar I/O power per bit, but Lovelace saves significant power from the larger L2, keeping data on chip, so there's less traffic going out to DRAM. So if you look at what RDNA 4 might do from RDNA 3, the power savings are most likely just going to come from going to a new GDDR standard, by the way, not from ever moving the MCD to a smaller node. Now, that is at least what one graphics engineer told me. I'm sure there's some nuance to it that another engineer could write in. The email to Moore's Law is Dead is on the YouTube channel if you go to the About section. So any graphics engineer can write in and give some input. But that is at least one senior professional's input on it. And I think that's interesting. And I think that tells you again why NVIDIA is making the decision they're making by trying to keep the bus width as small as possible on monolithic dies. And that also tells you why AMD insisted on using 6 nanometer for the memory dies for RDNA 3. And kind of sounds like that's what they'll probably do for RDNA 4 as well, if this is true. But anyways, back to the normal show. QH Freddy writes in and he says, how do you think Navi 33 is stacking up against Navi 21 now? In early leaks, I recall you saying it could get pretty close in 1080p to some of the Navi 21 cards. Could it still be a 192-bit card and do that, or will they go down to 128-bit and drop a lot of performance? Well, we already know Navi 33 is 128-bit from public information AMD's put about the 7600 MXT. And he says, is it going to be around 3060 Ti to 3070 performance, as you said in the last loose ends? Isn't that spectacular considering the 6650 XT gets within a kicking distance of the 3060 Ti already? Well, so Navi 33 is, I think, 204 millimeters squared. And from what I'm hearing, it depends, put it however you want, between 6700 and 6800, or between 3060 Ti and 3070. I mean, those are pretty close cards,
pretty
right?
Much the same.
Yeah, so that's what we're looking at in 1080p here. And we already know from publicly, benchmarked cards that at least it's beating a 4060 laptop card if you push it. So we don't know yet. That 4060 card on desktop is expected to be 3060 Ti. I think we can comfortably say it's going to be at least around there. And it all just depends on, okay, so this can use up to 120 watts on laptop. Does it max out then at 120 watts in performance? Or can they push it another 50 watts on desktop and get another 30% performance? We don't know. But it is 128-bit. My estimate of upper Navi 22 to maybe scratching the surface of Navi 21 and 1080p doesn't really change. And that is impressive considering its die size is like more than 10% smaller than Navi 23, meaning they can charge less. And so when you say, I think a lot of people are like, should they give it a 192-bit bus or give it for more RAM? Well, it's going to be 128-bit. I think what they should do is just make it $300 with 8 gigabytes. That's the solution here. Give it three. Make it three. They're already selling these other cards for like $250 that cost more to make. Make this $300, at most $330. I think $350 people would think it's stupid. And give it 8 gigabytes and then allow AIBs to clamshell on another 8 gigabytes, which would make it probably a $350 to $400 card. And I think you're done. I think if they did that, that's the way to go about it. You could have these $300 to $350 cards that match or beat the 4060 for less money with 8 gigabytes. And then you could have a 16 gigabyte variant that maybe gets close to 4060 Ti performance and has double the RAM for the same price. I think that's the way to go about it.
Yeah, and I think a card at like $300 that does 1080p high frame rate gaming pretty well would be very much welcomed in the current environment. So I don't know. There's definitely a space for something that performs well at 1080p that isn't just, I don't know, the 6500 XT again, like NVIDIA, like AMD seems to have hinted at with their last generation for some reason.
Well, yeah, and let's just be clear about this. I mean, I think there's going to be some people too who jump in here and go, well, you just complained about NVIDIA's, 8 gigabyte cards. What about AMD? And I'm like, well, yeah, but NVIDIA is still selling the 3070 Ti for over $600. If you make it $300, fine. That is low end.
And an 8 gigabyte card that's meant for like 1080p, like medium setting gaming, maybe high setting gaming is fine with 8 gigabytes. And frankly, like, I don't know how much benefit you really get out of loading higher than like medium or high textures at 1080p anyways. So you're not really losing much by not being able to do 1080p ultra if it goes over that 8 gigabyte capacity.
Mr. Sideburns writes in, and he asks, in the last loose ends, Tom, you mentioned that AMD may be implementing hardware fixes to make Chiplet RDNA 3 run without that artifact bug, and the Navi 32 variants. If this is true, do you think it is possible that we may have another Radeon 7 versus 5700 XT situation, where the 5700 XT released 6 months after the Radeon 7 and was slightly faster despite being a smaller die on the same node? Do you think top Navi 32 could match the 7900 XT? Well, it wasn't. Radeon 7 was stronger than the 5700 XT. You misremember.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true anymore. It wouldn't surprise me if RDNA 1's aged better. And not a lot of people benchmark the Radeon 7 anymore. What happened is the Radeon 7 launched for $700 early 2019. Then late 2019, 5700 XT launched. That was like 5 to 15% weaker. But no, wait, that didn't support ray tracing either, though. Yeah, but it had half the RAM, but it used less energy. So no, like what I would say is you misremember the performance difference. Unless you're seeing I'm wrong here, right?
If you got the Radeon 7 and then the 5700 XT came out later, I don't think you would like feel burned by getting
you double the RAM, and it's I was one of those people. It's 50, and I used it for rendering. So
yeah, and it had way better compute. But
yeah,
which if that matters to you, which if you're gaming, it doesn't really.
Well, remember, everyone now is an AI researcher because NVIDIA has CUDA. So just like everyone just overnight became a content creator because Vega was better at that. That's so stupid, that double standard I see in the comments. But do I think Navi 32 can match the 7900 XT? I mean, the 7900 XT performs 20% worse than the 7900 XTX right now. That compute part of the die, I mean, we're talking about something that's 50% bigger. So you're something 20% weaker on a die, 50% bigger. If they got fixes in Navi 32 that allowed them to have this thing run at like 3.2 gigahertz and stay below 250 watts or something, or even 300 watts, I don't think it will. I think the best you would see is it's within 10%. Which, if you remember Radeon 7 correctly, my friend, would be similar to that situation where the Radeon 7 remains stronger, but the other one was a lot more cost effective.
Yeah, and if you get a 7800 XT that's 10% weaker than the 7900 XT, I think you just get a card that you can price slightly higher than they would have anticipated. It's not completely upsetting their hierarchy.
But again, let's be very clear. I don't know for a fact that Navi 32 has a fix, nor a good fix. I think it has some sort of partial fix because it seems to be coming out later than expected, but I don't know. So don't expect this to be like a 3.5 gigahertz monster here, guys. But I do think it will clock faster than the 7900 XT. And so it'll be 10 to 20% weaker, which the 7900 XT like basically barely edges out the 6950 XT by like 10% or something, I believe, 10 to 15%. If it was 20% weaker, yeah, if it's 20% weaker than that, you're looking at 6800 XT to 6900 XT performance, 16 gigabytes. They'd probably call it the 7800 XTX and charge 600 to 700. They want to be generous, 600. What I think they should do, by the way, because that would crush if they launch it for the same price as the 4070, that'd be a huge deal. But I think that's what you should expect. Swiggles writes in and he says, do you think it's time for a paradigm shift? It feels like PC gaming has long gotten too bloated with SKUs and how powerful the components are getting, but they are too disconnected and spread apart on these large motherboards that have bad latency. The PS5 finally being taken advantage of is starting to show the cracks in how games are made. I mean, I don't think it's time for a paradigm shift. I think it's time for a few things. And it's funny. I've seen so many people, by the way, Dan, talk about, oh, we need a VRAM offloading accelerator card that I put in the other PCIe slot, or I need this, or I need that. Like, guys, that accelerator card would have massive latency penalties, number one. Number two, would probably cost hundreds of dollars. You know what's cheaper? If NVIDIA spends $30 and gives you 16 gigabytes. That's all it would cost to add 8 more gigabytes.
We hypothesized about this like in 2020, talking about how eventually it would lead the better I/O on the PS5 and the Series X would lead to an issue where with PC gaming, where what was it? These cards wouldn't have enough RAM anymore. And what's the possible solution? Who knows? Maybe they start putting like cheap NVMe drives or something on the graphics card or some bullshit like that. Or maybe,
I asked someone at NVIDIA about that, by the way, and the Unreal Engine 5 dev, and they were both like, let's just put 32 gigs of RAM.
Yeah, or maybe we get way better I/O. I wouldn't complain if I/O got better on PC. So these Gen 5 SSDs that people are buying are actually being fully utilized. But an obvious solution that I think was what was always going to happen is just increasing the amount of RAM you have on a graphics card to like, I don't know, 8 gigabytes is the low end, 32 gigabytes is the high end. Hopefully most things hit like the 16 to 24 gigabyte tier. And that's the shift that needs to happen if you want PCs to catch up to to mitigate the I/O issues that they have versus consoles.
Right. So, is it time for a paradigm shift? No, we just need, we need 12 gigabyte entry level cards, 16 gigabyte mid range cards, and 32 gigabyte high end cards. If we do that, and then everyone, and this is going to have to happen though, devs are going to have to mandate Gen 3 NVMe SSDs as well, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a lot of games don't allow you to use a hard drive anymore, right?
Yes. Or, yeah, well, I never brought this up. I did some testing with Harry Potter on my girlfriend's old laptop before I got her that Minis Forum APU PC to play it, which it plays it fine, 1080p 60. And she had a hard drive for some reason this like excavator laptop, and I bought a 400 megabyte per second, bandwidth USB drive to plug in it. And the Harry Potter game went from crashing within a minute to technically running at like 10, 20 frames a second. At minimum settings, look terrible. But I thought that was hilarious. Like, I didn't even change the drive the OS was running on. I just put in something a little slower than a SATA SSD, and it went from not running to running. And that alone tells you devs are basically, and you can see in the Harry Potter requirements, they're like, you probably need an SSD. They don't require it, but they basically require SATA SSDs by now. And I think within a year, you're going to see a lot of games required, and the recommended specs, they'll say Gen 3 NVMe SSD or Gen 4. Yeah. They might even just say Gen 4, because that way, if you're using a bargain bin Gen 4, they know you're at least Gen 3 speed. But, I think that's undoubtedly coming. And again, we don't need a paradigm shift. We need NVMe drives as standard. We need 32 gigabytes of RAM and your PC for DDR. And you need at least 16 gigabytes on the graphics card, maybe 24 in a few years. Not right now, in a few years. And if they do that, it's basically problem solved, guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a little funny. Like, the stuff we were talking about when the PS5 and Series X initially came out, the things you were talking about on the channel and like just us talking about in casual conversation, are all coming true. PCs need to start moving to requiring SSDs for gaming. A lot of games are requiring that now, or heavily recommending you have a solid state drive. And these small RAM buffers are beginning to become an issue.
And again, we don't need to fundamentally change how we run PC games on PC. We need NVIDIA to spend $30 on RAM for a mid-range card extra when they're already charging this much. We need you to spend $20 more on a nice SSD over the cheap one.
Yeah.
That's it. That sounds a lot simpler than fundamentally changing everything else. Yes. Way of the Lao writes in and says, "Hi guys, I love hearing the discussions on the show. I found Broken Silicon 6 months ago and eagerly await new ones every week. You'll have to forgive me if this comes off as rude when I ask this, then I am a fan, but what do you mean prices are going down and stock is sitting on shelves? I live in a rural area in the southwest of the United States, and the Best Buy is the only place to shop for electronics here. They do not usually release GPU stock in the store for people to look at and buy. I can buy them online, but the same model doesn't stay on the shelves long when it comes to the 4090. Still hard for me to find that. Furthermore, some models of the 4080 sell out on the site. And it's the same for Newegg. I know it's a big world with many other places to shop for them, but what do you mean? My dude, I checked when I was putting this script together. Maybe, Dan, you can double check right now while I'm talking. But I saw the 4080 at MSRP. And some models below MSRP. I saw multiple 4090 models at MSRP and refurbished models of the 4090 below MSRP. And my contacts keep sending me pictures of warehouses of these graphics cards. I don't know what to say. Like, have you forgotten last gen? The 3090 was like $3,000 for years. The 3080 was $1,500 half the time into 2022. We're not even a year after launch, and you can get some of these high-end cards for under MSRP, including AMD cards like the 7900 XTX. So I don't know what you're doing. I don't know where you're not looking.
Yeah, I mean, this is just how hardware works now. Things usually aren't reliably in stock, but it is very clearly different right now from what it was like 2 years ago, where you can, if you look around a little bit, you can usually find a 4080 in stock, especially if you live next to a micro center. They pretty much always have at least one of the models of all of the high-end cards in stock now. At least the one in Boston, which is the one that's closest to me, seems to usually have stuff in stock. And yeah, Newegg goes out of stock for everything pretty frequently, but it's also, from my experience looking at Newegg, it's kind of a coin flip if the card you're looking for will be available to buy or not. And it's usually at or near MSRP.
I'm looking at the 4080 Asus TUF on Newegg right now. MSRP free shipping. I'm looking at the Gigabyte, whatever it is, version. It's $30 below MSRP. It is in stock, free shipping. So where am I looking? Anywhere I look.
Yeah, right now I can buy I can
The PNY one's below MSRP.
If I want to, I can add this Gigabyte one to my cart for $1,150.
Yeah, there's one for $1,150.
Yeah.
Dude, they're and again, and I've seen people, I think in the loose end, someone asked, like, how long do we have to wait for prices to go down? Guys, they're already like $100, $200 cheaper than they were a couple of months ago. Keep waiting. They're going down in price.
Yeah, and it's just, you're seeing a lot of cards already go below MSRP. Things are, availability is way better. I mean, at the end of the day, I can't declaratively say if that's because there's more stock or if there's less demand, but either way, if you want to buy a card, it's easier to buy one right now.
All right. Speaking of things that are easy to buy, let us move on to a product that is currently hard to buy with story. I know. Very impressive transition. With story number 3, AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D review. Gaming efficiency for the win. That is the title from TechSpot, which I'm quoting for this write-up. Simply put, the Ryzen 7 7800X3D is the Zen 4 3D Vcache CPU that you should all be interested in. It's fast and extremely power efficient. For some reason, AMD decided it would be a good idea to delay the release of this model and instead lead with the 7950X3D and the 7900X3D, both of which arrived about a month ago. But this is the one you actually want. The 7950X3D is by no means a bad product, but it is a niche CPU that doesn't make sense from a pure gaming standpoint. With just one of the 2 CCDs armed with Vcache, the 16-core 7950X3D is heavily dependent on Windows addressing the correct core complex die, and that just doesn't always happen. Conversely, the 7800X3D basically matched the 7950X3D in our testing, making it just 3% faster than the 13900K. Well, that's technically a win for AMD. We think it's fair to say overall the performance is similar. Let me see. But it is worth noting that performance for the 13900K, 5% of that comes from using DDR5 6400 to 7200. So with more affordable memory, the 7800X3D can be around 7 or 8% or even faster than that than Intel's much more expensive flagship. The 7800X3D is one of the fastest gaming CPUs on the market, therefore, no matter what. And it's also by far the most power efficient while giving a high level of value compared to other flagships for $450. Yes, there are better deals overall, like the 7700 Non-X or even the 7600, but they're also slower. So when it comes to top-tier gaming performance, the value of the 7800X3D cannot be beaten right now if you want top-tier performance. You could also throw this thing on the absolute cheapest of AM5 boards you can find. We are talking about $100 here. And then the 7800X3D will still perform as shown in this review. And that is not something you can say about the i9 13900K, which is a MOSFET imploder on low-end boards. Well, it doesn't really blow them up, but it will heavily power limit itself and degrade its performance well below the 7800X3D. So, at the end of the day, arguing about which is the fastest gaming CPU between these is kind of silly. It's the very definition of a waste of time. They're all fast gaming CPUs. There's no chance any gamer will be able to tell them apart when actually gaming most of the time. Unless they stick their hand in the case, I guess, and you might notice the extra 100 watts of heat coming off of the i9. Therefore, the Ryzen 7 7800X3D has impressed us with its performance. We're not blown away by the FPS figures so much as we are blown away by the power efficiency, but how much gamers care about efficiency is hard to say. So, yep, there you go. There's the write-up. I just used Hardware Unbox /TechSpot. What do you think of the 7800X3D, Dan?
I mean, obviously, I think it's, if you're building a strictly gaming PC, this is clearly the best thing to get on the market if you're buying new parts. And then I would say if you're trying to stick to an old platform and you're like still on AM4, maybe getting the 5800X3D is still a viable option. But from where I see it, it seems like this. I think the 7700 and the 7800X3D are the 2 CPUs to get right now for gaming.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, I if you want to save, well, based on pricing right now, if you want to save a decent amount of money, the 7700 is a great option. And if you want to have the best gaming CPU on the market, wait for it to drop in price a little bit to actually hit closer to its MSRP.
Yeah, and when I look around online, it's sold out on AMD.com. It's in stock on Amazon, but it's
$550, I think.
The algorithm threw it up to 550. And on Newegg, just for completionism, let us see, 520. Ooh, $30 cheaper. Oh, and it's a limited time offer that it's $520. The funny thing is that would still be cheaper than an i9 while using like a third the energy. So I guess that's why it's selling out. This is the enthusiast gaming CPU people are choosing. And it's one that I can recommend for pure enthusiast gamers or people with a small form factor build. You can put a low profile cooler on this thing and you're going to get 99% of the performance. Not true with Zen 4 and doubly not true with the Raptor Lake i9s or i7s or i5s really. I mean, those ones use 200 watts actually. So, I mean, what I like about it is even though it's not the best price performance, at least you're paying more, not just for another 10% gaming performance probably. Although sometimes I know it's like 50%. But you're also paying more for half the power usage. So at least it's like you are getting the most premium product in every department. And I just, I don't see the point in getting a 7950X3D for a similar overall reason to the i9, except it's different supporting reasons. It's like, I just don't see who this is for. I don't see who needs, I know developers have told me they love the 7950X3D, but most people here aren't developers, I assume.
Oh, yeah, I guess developer would specifically kind of make sense for the X3D.
It's really good at like code compiling. They have the extra threads. So I get it. But I'm just saying, if you're going to do multi-threaded stuff, I don't see who the i9's for because the amount you're going to have to spend on RAM, cooling, expensive motherboards that won't explode when you turn on the i9, and then the extra power consumption, you'll save the 5% in multi-threading. Or in some multi-threading apps, the 7950X wins in like half of them anyways. So you probably just go for the 7950X. And then if you're gaming, well, either you want a good price performance or you want the best. And at least with the best here, it's also the most efficient. So I like the 7800X3D. I really don't think the 7900X3D should exist. And I think the 7950X3D, there's an argument that shouldn't either from my perspective. But, we've discussed that ad nauseum in other pieces of content.
Yeah, and this, the 7950X3D, it's just, if you're a gamer, the 7800X3D is a better option. Sure, maybe there's like a couple scenarios with the 7950X3D where if you're like really making sure you're keeping track of everything, you'll overall get better performance by like disabling certain CCDs when you decide to play a certain game. Or you cannot be incredibly pedantic about a few frames and just get the 7800X3D and overall get basically the same performance you would get with the 7950X3D and save a few $100.
Yeah. But I mean, that's really all I have to say about this. We already did an over 1 hour die shrink on the 7800X3D and what it means for the market long-term, Intel versus AMD. That's a over 1 hour video breaking things down based on fan submissions. For those who support us on Patreon, so please, $2 a month will get you access to that. Otherwise, I'm going to move on because the reviews really weren't that surprising to me. QH Freddy writes in and he says, do you think it would have been worth it for AMD to push Vcache optimization more towards frequency to avoid stunting the clocks on the desktop X3D parts? Well, first of all, Vcache was really made for servers, so it's a happy accident that it boosts gaming performance. Additionally, so it was always going to be server first, and that's optimized for lower voltages. But having said that, I just have to say, QH Freddy, I've leaked this. Angstronomics has leaked this. I know there's 5.9 gigahertz yields of Zen 4 before it even came out. For all I know, there are some yields that at their higher voltages can hit 6 gigahertz sustainably. But those are all going to Epic, clocked lower to use less energy. I don't know if the 7800X3D could be a 5.5 gigahertz part if they gave it the best yields. But they're taking so much server market share, they're not even going to consider doing that. So I can't answer this question, QH Freddy, without knowing how bad of yields it's getting, because I suspect they're not the best yield.
Yeah, I mean, if they're selling all of their gangbusters in server, it just makes sense that they would put all of their highest binned, all of their best yields in server, because that is higher margin than this. So it's unfortunate with like PC gaming, but to an extent, PC gaming, you're getting the rejects from server in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So I don't know. I can't know for sure. And I mean, for gamers, I don't know. There's an argument that hopefully Zen 5 can hit 6 gigahertz with Vcache, but at the end of the day, Vcache is meant for servers, and I don't think they're going to fundamentally change the design for gamers, most likely. That might change next gen, though, because they seem to be going for clocks more in server, even more so than now, though. We'll see.
Yeah.
Chris Rich writes in, is buying a 7800X3D today similar to stretching to get a 12 or 16 gigabyte card in 2020? What I'm saying is, if you want your CPU to last 3 to 5 years in gaming, it's probably your best option. If you're happy to upgrade every 1 to 2 years, though, it's probably overkill. Sure, something like an 8-core Zen 5 will likely be a bit faster on gaming on average. Oh, I think so. And in productivity casts, it's going to crush in productivity in particular. But I wouldn't expect it to be much cheaper on release. The 7800X3D is also low maintenance in the sense that it works fine on cheap motherboards, cheap memory, and cheap coolers. I mean, I think people who got the 5800X3D don't regret it. So I just say it's pretty much the same situation. If you need it now, you want it now. There's a lot of games that just scale absurdly better than the average forever and uses less energy. Yeah, I don't know.
And I would add about like the distinction between like this is good for the 3 to 5 year upgrade type person. I know there are people that upgrade yearly to every generation, but like, do you really need a CPU more than every 3 to 5 years? I mean, I think all I'm saying is I think 3 to 5 years upgraders describes most people when it comes to CPUs, at least.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so I think overall it's the same situation as the 5800X3D, but with a couple key differences. Number one, the 5800X3D was not the best gaming CPU. I actually recommended Alder Lake over it most of the time. Again, unless you already had DDR4. Well, no, I mean, because you can use DDR4 with Alder Lake, unless you already had an AM4 system. But this time it is the best. And Intel probably doesn't have anything that'll beat it for a year. And so at least now, for the same price as what the 5800X3D was at launch, I mean, now it is the best, and it will be for a year. The 5800X3D really wasn't. It was just arguably the best. And so I guess that's that little extra little star on top of. But even though Zen 5's coming in, you can upgrade now. It is actually the best now, too. So overall, it's just, I mean, come on, guys. It's the best gaming CPU. There will be better ones in a year. That's not going to change next year, though, either. Especially with what we know from what I've leaked with Zen 5, now that we move to story number 4. Jessie here loves sticks, but it definitely wouldn't be healthy if I just let her chow down on them all the time, as much as she would like to. The same is usually true for reasonably priced instant meals for humans. It's easy to feel stuck looking for something that's quick to cook, tasty, healthy, and cheap all at the same time. Well, unless you consider Vite Ramen, this piece of content is sponsored by Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen is a healthy, tasty, and shelf-stable food crafted by an American startup that offers a ton of options for eating healthy, like their classic packages that make it easy for you to add protein and other ingredients of your choice to make a complete hearty meal, or their Ramen Go packages that offer a healthy, microwavable option for those who truly only have a 15-minute lunch break, whether at the office or at home. Click on the link in the description and use the offer code BROKENSILICON to save 10% on a variety of different products, including special bundles just for Moore's Law's Dead fans, raw nudes if you want to make up your own recipes, and other food products, cooking utensils, and more. And when you order this spring, know that Vite just shut down for 3 months and relaunched their entire operation to improve speed, customer service, and just to improve things in the back end so they can keep up with how popular their product has become. Supporting them helps support me, and even just clicking on the link below makes a big difference. But I really do like their product and I recommend it. So if you're hungry for something that's healthy, cheap, and easy to make, check out Vite Ramen and use offer code BROKENSILICON today. Two big Zen 5 leaks came out of Moore's Law's Dead in the past fortnight, and this is the gist of them. Zen 5 is launching in the first half of 2024, possibly Q1 even, and at least the first Zen 5 launched parts are going to have 8-core CCXs on 8-core chiplets that utilize TSMC's 4nm node for the desktop and Turin standard variants. What that means is, 16 cores on AM5 yet again, but in server, 128 cores with EPYC. However, AMD has designed at least a 16-core CCX, maybe higher or a little lower than that too. I don't know what other variants they've designed, but I know for a fact they've designed a unified 16-core CCX designed for 3 nanometer for Zen 5. That will at least be seen in Bergamo Next and Serrano. Serrano is the successor to Sienna, guys, with Zen 5C, but could also be seen with a unified 16-core Zen 5 product as well if TSMC's yields improve sufficiently. That means Bergamo Next goes up to 192 cores of Zen 5C for now, but I have no reason to believe they couldn't launch a 16-core unified version of Zen 5 too. And I want to be clear about why I say that. They're the same architecture. Zen 5, Zen 5C, they're the same architecture, guys. The only difference is more cache on there. So if they spent the money to do a hard design for Zen 5C, it's a unified 16-core CCX.
There's probably one for
Zen 5 standard.
Yeah.
And even if the die is too big, by the way, to fit 2 of them on AM5, they can make an IO die that fits one unified 16-core and probably get an overall performance boost just from doing that. So just remember, that is possible. And it is still possibly possible as well that they have a 32-core version of Zen 5, or at least a 32-core version of Zen 5C for AM5 whenever the yields are good enough. And again, this is different than Bergamo. Bergamo uses 2 8-core CCXs per 16-core chiplet. Not the case here. They designed a full 16-core IP block. So just that's the distinction, but I think I had to make that clear. Moving forward, though, as for the IPC, Moore's Law is dead has leaked that Zen 5 should get at least around a 20% IPC increase, if not higher. And this is mostly coming from the addition of more combined L1 cache per core compared to Zen 4, but also a fully redesigned architecture. Does not seem like, at least, I did ask someone else, back this up for now. It doesn't seem like L2 and L3 are going up significantly in the 4 nanometer variant. I've heard there could be more L2 cache for some of the 3 nanometer variants, which was interesting, but at least the 4 nanometer Zen 5, it seems like it's mostly from L1 and they just redid the architecture. And so, yeah, I mean, they can give you 20% more IPC with a similar family of nodes, supposedly, without massively increasing the cache. And furthermore, Moore's Law sources indicate that Zen 5 seems to be getting a single-digit clock speed bump. This is backed up by a leaked snapshot of Windows Task Manager running on a Turin system that was boosting to 3.85 gigahertz with a 64-core variant, whereas Genoa variants right now only boost to 3.75 gigahertz, which is a big deal considering this is A0 silicon. And so there you go. AMD's Zen 5 seems to be clearly on track, likely launching in Q1 of next year, if not Q2 at the latest. And although the 16-core stagnation on AM5 will undoubtedly disappoint some people, it will be 16 cores that, because they use the same family of node as Zen 4 does right now at TSMC, should cost the same to manufacture and should not see a big pricing increase unless AMD gets greedy. And they will be 25 to 35% better again, just around a year after Zen 4 came out. Oh, and DDR5 support should go up to at least 7,200 megatransfer on server, which means probably 8,000 or more on desktop. The IO die is slightly improved, so expect, again, better memory controller, a little bit better graphics, newer USB, but nothing crazy in the IO die. And I added this last minute here. I am told, and I wasn't quite sure what some of my sources were talking about before I put the video up, but I've had more clarification, that those 64-core Turin variants that I had the Cinebench leak for, apparently they had AI accelerator chiplets on them. Now, I don't think that would have helped Cinebench, but just so you know, yeah, it's a separate chiplet with like a Xilinx accelerator on standard Turin. So that's new information. I think that's exciting. Okay, I'm tired. What do you think of Zen 5, Dan?
All I can say is, like, without a core count increase in Zen 5 next year, hopefully we'll see something come of those 16-core CCXs for the standard core design on, like, Threadripper or something. I don't know, and maybe that won't be as much of a token effort anymore, because Threadripper has been kind of, or at least this generation of Threadripper really didn't have that much to offer, I don't think. And I don't know. I think if you might be able to see higher core counts with Threadripper. Maybe we'll be stuck at 16 cores for another generation, but I don't think gamers really need to care that much about 16 cores because I think we're still doing fine. It's 8 cores for the most part. One thing I will say, though, that's been highlighted on previous generation, on previous content and stuff is the fact that there is some spillover in gaming. So a unified 16 core would be nice to have as opposed to it being
it would boost gaming performance. I think
especially in certain games that would get rid of like the gigantic latency penalty you have on the 2 different CCXs.
When you have a game that could use 10 cores but doesn't need 16, it still has the same latency penalty spilling over from an 8-core CCX to the other chiplet. That would be avoided if there was a unified 16 core. So yeah, I think that's worth pointing out here. I don't know for sure, but it's quite conceivable. I think we're going to get single-digit clock speed increases. We're already at 5.7 gigahertz now, and I'm told if they wanted to, they could hit 6 gigahertz probably with Zen 4, but they're not bothering to with consumer products. It just make financial sense. So it's quite conceivable that what you get next year is something with like 25% higher IPC, at least 20% higher IPC than Zen 4 that runs at maybe 6 gigahertz. And then they launch that. And so what would that give you? Well, overall, they'll probably give you something 30% better in single threading, maybe with lower power consumption as well. We'll see. And then that launches February next year, maybe. And then quarter 3, quarter 4, they launch. They could even call it Zen 5 Plus if they want to market it that way. A I/O die that fits a single 16-core 3 nanometer CCX that they then put V-Cache on top of. And that might boost gaming performance another 20-30%. So
yeah,
AMD's got options here. And as much as some people want more cores on desktop, I don't think you need more than 16 cores. I think what you need is Threadripper to be an option.
Do you think there's also potential that they move back, it makes sense for them to move back to an almost more traditional style where they have potentially 2 dies for Zen 5, one 8-core and one 16-core? That's just, both of them are unified one CCX, and then the 16-core just has, they have 16 or 12 cores enabled, and they have the 8-core die that is 8 or like 6 cores enabled.
So you're saying the 2 chiplets are like a unified 24-core?
No, I'm saying
not unified, but one chiplet 24-core.
I'm saying move back to just having multiple different CPU dies that they put into different products instead of just using the same CCX for however many products they release.
You mean like on Strix or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, remember, these are fundamentally the same architecture, so it wouldn't surprise me if what they do with Strix is they have a unified CCX that's 8 Zen 5, 8 Zen 5C, but they share the same L3 cache, and so there's zero penalties, but they're able to fit 4 more cores than they may, or 4 to 8 more cores than they normally would be able to. Like, that's something I would assume they're doing with Strix. And again, the way the scheduling works right now at Zen is they just pick the higher boosting core for when they need to. I don't see why you don't just share the L3 cache between 8 Zen 5, 8 Zen 5C, and then 6 gigahertz cores are over here, 4.5 gigahertz cores are over here. Why not? And that's huge. That'll be a huge deal.
Yeah, I mean, if the scheduling is as simple as that, and you just have cores that
you just get to add more cores, yeah.
And you just have cores that have slightly lower clock speeds. That's scheduling sounds, hopefully, like there wouldn't be any issues with it. Although AMD does like having software issues at launch, so you never know.
I've heard there's some minor things they have to do with scheduling, but they're minor.
Okay.
So that's what I've heard. Don't expect to have the Xbox app open in every Zen PC next year. I honestly think what they did with Zen 4 X3D is pretty clumsy. I bet they would agree to in hindsight, or if they don't, they need a reality check. But yeah, so, and I wasn't quite sure if this was part of your question, but my understanding is AMD plans all Zen 5 or all Zen 5C on desktop for now.
Okay.
That they don't see a point in mix and matching, because why add complexity to the scheduling? And I agree. Who wants 8 Zen 4 or Zen 5 plus 16 Zen 5C? Don't you just want 32 cores at 4.5 gigahertz or 16 cores at 6 gigahertz?
Most likely.
That's what I would do,
Yeah, most likely.
I mean, I don't see who that's really for. And if you think about it, guys, the reason a lot of people would say, but yeah, Intel lets you have the best of both worlds. No, they don't. No, they don't. They have to give you little cores because their big cores take up so much die space that they can't afford to design 20 different options. I already did this in the Intel's Nerf Future video where I showed like AMD is like an IO die for server, an IO die for desktop / laptop with Dragon Range. And they designed Zen 4 and Zen 4C chiplets. They have 4 chiplets. They made Sienna, Bergamo, Genoa, Dragon Range, Raphael. So 5 products at least from 4 and then if you add the Vcache one, Genoa X, Dragon Range X, like you're getting like 50% more products from the amount of chiplets you have to design. Intel 8+8 or 8+20, 8+16, 8+8. I think then they have 6+0, 4+0. That's just to cover the desktop lineup. Then 6+8 for laptop, 2+8 for laptop. There's 2 different dies for Sapphire Rapids. I believe there's new ones for Sapphire Rapids HBM. And then Fishhawk Falls, the other thing. Guys, they have to design like 12 chiplets for 6 products. AMD can design 5 or 6 for like 20 products. So Intel doesn't let you choose between an all little core or like a 2 big core plus 32 little core, or just an all 10 or 12 core big core because they don't have the money to design all this crap for niche areas. AMD can just go, we don't need to design a new thing. We're just giving you 2 Zen 4C chiplets or Zen 5C chiplets, depending on the thing. And I think that's an advantage AMD should capitalize on, is not wasting this mixed threading. Just go to 32 cores for those who need it.
Yeah, I mean, if Intel were offering you, quote unquote, the best of both worlds, they would have a 10-core processor that clocks to 6 gigahertz and currently has the gaming crown. But they don't have that.
Exactly. All AMD had to do was take a server chiplet and throw it in with a different IO die. They're done.
Yeah.
That's it. Carino Sugata writes in and says, hi, Tom, would you consider Intel's Granite Rapids to be a success if it scares AMD into releasing standard Zen 5 on 3 nanometer? I think that's about the only thing that would force AMD's hand on this, assuming that Zen 6 is not massively delayed. I think Zen 5 coming to 3 nanometer is going to be almost wholly dependent on if TSMC's yields and pricing get to a place where it makes sense to launch it to desktop, or that's it. Like Intel's launching we'll get to it soon, like Arrow Lake probably mid next year. So after Zen 5's already out, they'll have their 3 nanometer options to fight Arrow Lake if they need to, or they can just throw Vcache on the 4 nanometer versions and probably offer something that ties Arrow Lake's gaming performance at half the cost to manufacture. Remember, Arrow Lake's using N3X or Intel 20A is what I'm told for laptop. So they're using the most expensive 3 nanometer node to give you, I believe, 20 to 30% more IPC than Redwood Cove. So if Zen 5 is, let's say, 30% better single threading than Zen 4, Arrow Lake looks like it's maybe 50% better than Zen 4, but then you add Vcache, now they're tied in gaming. AMD's cost half as much to make. I mean, they could go to 3 nanometer if they want to and boost it more, maybe, but I think it's mostly just based on TSMC's yields. And I think AMD is going to be more okay with it than you think if they lose to Intel in gaming by 5 to 10% again, but their product's $500 and Intel's is $800. That's how they won market share with Zen 1 Plus, and I don't think they care.
I mean, just with the way that TSMC prices their nodes at this point, like, unless they're making just absurdly large margins, which I guess at the end of the day, I don't know what their true margins are for CPUs. It has to be the price of the node to some large extent that dictates which nodes they go with. Because TSMC can basically charge seemingly whatever they want to at this point for their new nodes.
Well, they thought they could, but people are cutting orders, whether it's NVIDIA, Apple, and maybe even AMD a little, although I don't think AMD really is, to a large extent. So I think in TSMC is learning, we charge 50 to 80% more for, it depends who you ask. I'd say it's 30 to 80% more for 5 nanometer over 7. I don't think they're going to get away with charging another 50% more for 3 nanometer. I don't. I think they're
praying
going to
they
have to
don't.
charge 20% more. And I think they're going to have to live with that.
Yeah.
Too bad, TSMC. My boy writes in, and he says, in a previous episode, my point wasn't that AMD's position is bad right now. My point is that their superior position isn't enough to really win for good. The same way I think NVIDIA's CEO Jensen Huang won against AMD 10 years ago. You ought to make it sound, at least in my opinion, as if Intel was pretty much out of the race versus AMD for the foreseeable future. Well, I think of them more like boxers on the 8th round. Intel is very, very winded and keeps taking hard punches. Maybe Intel will go down eventually, but right now they're still capable of throwing clean punches back. You said clean punches. Which one is it in this analogy? Because I agree with your analogy. Intel is a very, very winded person getting punched in the head by AMD over and over. I'm not saying they're out, but are you going to bet your mortgage that it's going to turn around the other way soon? And I don't think that AMD has won for good yet. That if that's what it sounds like I'm saying, it's not. I just don't see the argument for how Intel turns things around until 2025. And by then, they could be financially in ruin. This isn't hyperbole, guys. They're making products that have like less than half the margins of AMD. AMD, it sounds like, might get to 40% market share this year. Okay. If they're making higher margins at 40% market share, they're going to be making more money overall than Intel soon in some segments. Intel has latent capacity no one wants. It's going to be years before anyone wants to use Intel's nodes in a major way like they do TSMC or Global Foundries or Samsung.
I mean, yeah, it's just Intel's at a point right now where they've been losing their position for years now. They came out with Alder Lake, which was a decent response, and it doesn't look like they're going to have anything, at least for desktop, until maybe Arrow Lake that's actually decent. So we'll see. But it's just like, yeah, I guess they're throwing a clean punch or whatever once every 3 to 4 years at this point. And I don't doubt that eventually they can claw their way back, and AMD will at some point be in the position where where they have the worst products because things trade back and forth over time. But at least for 5+ years, I think AMD is going to keep being dominant.
No, I agree.
And past that, I just think it's too far out for anybody that's like not inside the company to really have any good idea of where it will go.
Yeah, and it's like, I'm not saying Intel isn't going to make products that are competitive with AMD. I'm just saying, as long as AMD keeps launching like they did with Zen 4 versus Raptor Lake, products that are cheaper to make and launch months before the competition and continue to take market share in server with those variants, I'm not seeing where Intel turns this around because they're launching later and making less money.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if they beat them. They're making less money. You'd hope they beat them. They're making less money off of it. It's costs more. I mean, Alexander writes in and says, will a computer with a decent contemporary gen CPU and GPU ever be CPU bound in mini games again? Or will we continue to be always GPU bound at reasonable settings and resolutions? How do you define CPU bound? Because I've noticed a lot of people complaining about bad CPU performance with console ports, and I don't know if they understand that the devs are maxing out a 3.5 gigahertz Zen 2 8-core on PS5. Right, but that's to get to around 60 frames per second. So if you want to get to 120
or 240,
you need something with double the single-threaded and at least 8 cores and probably 12 cores to make up for the I/O to do other tasks at the same time. So, yeah, I mean, there's no way around it. When you add in the I/O controller with the PS5's CPU, 7900X might be needed for 120 hertz in a game that maxes out the PS5 CPU. You need double the single threading and more cores, not a 5600X. You know what I mean? And so is your argument 120 hertz? Yeah, I mean, I think Zen 5 and onwards until the PlayStation 6 comes out, although we don't even know if that's really going to do, if that'll change anything. PS4 certainly didn't make you need a stronger CPU.
No.
You know, I think Zen 5 is going to do 120 hertz gaming fine. But here's the thing. You say CPU bound. Everyone's definition of CPU bound is different. Nobody thinks any of the recent releases of CPU issues if the game at 60 hertz. But now we all seem to expect 120 hertz. I think in 2025, there'll be a lot of 480 hertz gamers. So I think that's going to be where things move next. And good news, Zen 6 will probably have double the single threading of Zen 4. So I think we'll be there. But
or at a minimum, 240 hertz is going to become more common over time. Sure. And a lot of CPUs right now that are out right now just can't run a game at 240 hertz. And that's not to
some of them can, but
that's not to say it's bad. That's not to say these are bad CPUs. It's just nothing needs to run at 240 hertz.
Yeah. All right.
Unless it's CS:GO, then it does need to run at 800 hertz or whatever the hell people run that at.
Of course it does, and that's why I need to get Raptor Lake to play Counter-Strike Go at 900 frames per second, because that's why you get cutting-edge CPUs. All right. Moving on, something else that will run Counter-Strike at 900 frames per second. I have a leak about a Meteor Lake. So I just didn't know what piece of content I would have time to put this in, and why not Broken Silicon? So I'm putting a quote on screen right now, and basically a couple contacts tell me at Intel that it's fairly safe to assume that Meteor Lake is going to hit around 5 gigahertz, at least. It's already, I've heard 4.7 gigahertz or higher right now, so there's almost no chance the top models of Meteor Lake won't be at 4.7 gigahertz. They think they'll get to 5 gigahertz, and they're hoping to get it to 5.4 gigahertz, but they're not confident yet that they can achieve that. And so one of the contacts especially wanted me to make it clear. This is good news for anyone thinking, Meteor Lake can't get past 3 gigahertz. That's not going to happen. It's going to hit around 5 gigahertz. It might hit 5.4 gigahertz. And because I expect Redwood Cove to be like a 12 to 20% IPC increase, something around there, I think that compared to Raptor Lake mobile CPUs, this will be the best gaming CPU. It's going to be like Tiger Lake, I think, where, yes, you could use Comet Lake, but Tiger Lake at 5 gigahertz with 8 cores was technically the best gaming CPU at the time. I think that's going to be true of Meteor Lake. However, my sources also insisted on making this clear. Well, Raptor Lake hits 6 gigahertz now. Raptor Lake refresh may hit 6.1, 6.2 gigahertz. I mean, if Meteor Lake's only 10 to 20% higher IPC or something, it doesn't really make sense to make Meteor Lake a gaming flagship on desktop where you can use extra power. That's why they're choosing to go with Raptor Lake refresh for desktop and extreme laptops for another year. So Meteor Lake is good. The 6+8 variant's going to be great. If they can get it out in Q3, I think this will be a better than Tiger Lake situation where they have a good premium thin and light flagship that kind of beats AMD across the board. But if it comes out Q1, I think Strix is going to crush it. And there's a reason they're not bothering to bring it to desktop. Both because Raptor Lake can clock 20% faster, probably, or at least 10, 15% faster, which negates the IPC difference. And because, they're probably going to want all volume they have to take laptop market share anyways. There's no point in wasting that volume on desktop, most likely. Although, again, as far as I've heard, they could still launch a 6+8 variant to desktop, but I still think the 6+16 variant's canceled. All right. What do you think, Dan?
Unless Meteor Lake can hit, like 5.4, 5.6 gigahertz, I don't see why you would release it.
But it still only has 6 big cores, so the 8 cores at 6.2 is probably going to tie Meteor Lake in desktop gaming. In older games, Meteor Lake actually might crush it. But in the latest that need 8 cores,
branding this as more of a follow-up to Tiger Lake and just putting it in thin and light seems like a way better decision to make this look like. Well, I shouldn't say make it look like, because it's a good CPU in the right context, and putting it in that right context is what
it might double Raptor Lake performance per watt on laptop. That's good. That's very impressive.
It's just not necessarily going to bring anything new to desktop. So might as well refresh Raptor Lake if you can get a couple 100 more megahertz out of it,
and maybe 10 to 20% higher all-core boost clocks, especially. Then it would crush Meteor Lake in multi-threading.
Yeah. So, Meteor Lake, I think that's the expectation everyone had, is it's not going to be anything to write home about for desktop. But if it can hit 5 gigahertz, that'll be good in thin and lights.
Yeah, it just needs to frickin' come out on time, Intel.
Well, Yeah, don't bet money with Intel for that. But
the only other thing I would say is, hey, if it hits 5.4 gigahertz, I still think there's an argument for them to launch, what would it be, Z890, and put Meteor Lake on that as the i5-14 600K, because you can bring something for $350 that ties the previous gen gaming flagship at half the power on a new platform. At least by the time you launch Arrow Lake, motherboards will be widely supplied and cheaper. You already have an i5 sitting there. So I still think there's an argument for doing that. But again, only if Intel has the bandwidth to handle that at the time.
Yeah.
I think there's an argument they might not. And that's why they would cancel Meteor Lake Desktop. Chris Rich writes in and says, Meteor Lake is quite a radical change to Intel's design and manufacturing process, but I see little discussion about it these days. Okay, it might not be coming out on desktop, but the laptop market is far larger, no matter how significant it might become for the general laptop market. Would it be fair to say that it's going to be a non-event for gaming enthusiasts? Is it literally too little too late? If it comes out after Strix and Zen 5, who gives a shit? But
yeah,
if it comes out this year in decent volume, which I don't know, I'm basically told you shouldn't expect it to before Q4, but fingers crossed they pull it up, because I've heard Pat Gelsinger's like yelling at people every week to pull up the launch because he knows they need it. I don't know. I think it will be an event for laptop, because I mean, if it hits 5.4 gigahertz on laptop, or even just like 5.2, 15% higher IPC, that would be like if there was a 6 gigahertz Raptor Lake chip that uses like 65 watts. That's something for laptop gaming that will be 20% better than Phoenix, at least. That's something.
Yeah, I just, those launches just don't usually get as much fanfare as desktop launches do, because desktop people are the people that like talking about their computers the most generally.
Yeah. Or people who like talking about computers end up getting desktops and then talk about them all the time.
Yes.
TMC Payton writes in and he says, howdy, normalizing for everything else, price, performance, features, how much more power efficient would a CPU or GPU have to be for you to swap to the more efficient part? How much do you actually value power efficiency compared to other metrics? If it's half the power, I'll take a 10% performance hit.
Yeah, that's definitely, especially if like you have a relatively small case, definitely. Or or that's a thing that you want.
And I think we've seen people in the past make the argument gamers don't really care about power consumption. They say they do, and they want to argue for their fanboy company that they're fanboying for. But I actually don't think that's entirely fair. I think that the Kepler efficiency advantage, or the Maxwell one compared to Fury, has just often been overblown. Maxwell was more efficient, but I mean, I'm trying to think of like a comparison here. The 970 used 120 watts. Tonga used 80 watts, 180 watts, and it was like 20% weaker for the full 380X, I believe, maybe 10% weaker. So you have NVIDIA with a card that uses like 30 to 50 less watts and is 10% better. That's not like double the efficiency. It's like rarely ever been the case where it's been twice as bad. The only time I can think of is like 1080 versus Vega Liquid, or something insane like, that. So even the 3090 versus 6900 XT, 20% loss in efficiency.
Yeah, I think especially in the past, people made really big deals a lot of time about relatively small differences in efficiency, where it's like 10% differences in efficiency, and people are acting like that makes all of the difference, which no, that's not meaningfully different. Yeah. Then when you get into like the modern CPU landscape, where some CPUs are like 40-50% less efficient than others, it's like, and that difference is the difference between being able to use a low profile cooler in a small form factor case versus almost needing a liquid cooling solution for the other one. Well, those are very different products at that point. And I think you obviously go for the more efficient one.
Yeah. And so to put this in terms of like real world comparisons, the 4070 is like a 180 watt card that performs like a 3080 kinda. Okay. Well, if the 7800 XTX is the same price and it uses 250 watts, but it's 10% stronger, I don't think anyone cares about that 70 watts. You get 16 gigs of RAM instead of 12, and it's a little stronger.
Yeah.
I wouldn't get the 4070. But if it was, 350 watts, oh yeah, I get the 4070.
Yeah.
And that is why I think the i9 13900K is stupid, because it is double the power consumption of a 7950X that only if you have the fastest RAM wins in gaming by like 5% or something, maybe. And in multi-threading, it trades blows. It's like, well, yeah, this is a ridiculous choice, I think. So, but it's rare we see the comparison that big. But hey, we might in a few generations. We'll see what happens with NVIDIA and AMD. All right, now let us move on to the final story. Story number 6. Intel confirms basically everything Moore's Law has leaked about servers with Sierra Forest, Granite Rapids, and more. We'll be brief about this. On March 29th, Intel confirmed the following during their data center and AI investor webinar. The company will split its Xeon CPU offerings between performance and efficient optimized architectures. Sierra Forest, leaked in detail by Moore's Law is Dead months ago to have this core count, is the first of these architectures and confirmed to feature 144 E-cores on the standard non-giant version of the server socket. I'm told the double tile version for both Granite Rapids and Sierra Forest comes later this year, or for Sierra Forest later this year. I guess maybe Granite Rapids will come sooner. And this is supposed to launch within the first half of next year against AMD's 192-core Zen 5C products. So that's correct. Intel is launching 144 little cores to server early next year, whereas AMD will be launching 192 Zen 5C cores. Good luck, Intel. This will then be followed up by Clearwater Forest, supposedly in 2025. Intel also confirmed the dual-tile Emerald Rapids, which utilizes a variant of Raptor Cove for up to 68 cores, although possibly maxing out at 64 cores, like Sapphire Rapids is supposed to at 56. And this is supposedly going to launch before the end of the year. And then Granite Rapids launches closely after Sierra Forest, which I assume means Q3 next year. I don't know. Anyways, that's it. The good news is that Intel does seem to be making up for lost ground if they can launch all of these products when they say they will. Granite Rapids should have similar core counts to Turin, similar performance. Emerald Rapids will lose to Genoa undoubtedly, but at least it's making up some lost ground. But the bad news is that they cost more to produce than AMD, and so they could be financial disasters if each of them slips to even half a year later. By then, AMD would have better products out that are cheaper to manufacture, taking up server contracts, while Intel maybe has latent capacity. And again, that's why I've heard Wendell brought this up, that Sapphire Rapids is really easy to get a hold of if you're a server customer. Yeah, they got a lot of extra capacity now at Intel. No one wants their crap. So, or less of the market does. So, yeah, I mean, there you go. I mean, there's really nothing that new here, but they confirm things we've been talking about for a while. And really the things I noticed that really stuck out to me were Sierra Forest on track for first half of next year, Granite Rapids following closely behind it.
Yeah.
What does that mean, Intel? Just give us a quarter.
Like, there's no way to know with Intel at this point. I honestly have no faith in just their launch schedules. I would say follow close after means anywhere within 9 months to a year afterwards. I mean, you would think if they're noting that it's close, it should be like a relatively quick turnaround, like 6 to 9 months. But I don't know. All of their deadlines seem to expand out over time.
Yeah. So again, it doesn't look bad. Granite Rapids uses Redwood Cove Plus, which is a non-irrelevant IPC increase over Redwood Cove. It's kind of like I've heard halfway between Lion Cove and Arrow Lake and Redwood Cove. So yeah, that'd probably 20% higher IPC maybe, than what they have now with Raptor Cove, which is about equal to Zen 4. Yeah, it might be directly competitive with Zen 5. But it doesn't have more cores. It'll probably, in fact, it could have slightly less cores and it costs more to make. So if it doesn't come out at the same time as Zen 5, I'm just forced to sit here and go, why would anyone get this instead? AMD has mindshare now. AMD's known for reliability now. It's not enough, Intel, to match AMD with something that costs more. You have to cost less now. So
yes, when a product is worse, it should generally cost less than its competitor.
And by the end of next year, the 288 core variant of Sierra Forest is supposed to come out. I'm told those cores will at best perform like Xeon Ice Lake cores, although some of my contacts think it might perform like Ice Lake Threads, meaning it might actually be equivalent to a 144 core Ice Lake because it had hyperthreading. If that's true, I don't know how the hell that's going to compete with a 192 core Zen 5C, but
I don't think it will, really.
It won't.
It has to come out before Zen 5C does.
I think so.
Have any effect.
And it should probably come out a quarter or so before it. But if it doesn't, my God. QH Freddy writes...
I was just going to say, 3 months does not sound like a very long time, though, when we're talking about Intel's deadlines. Or Intel's execution on their deadlines.
Slipping 3 months, you mean?
Yeah.
Not the craziest thing you'd expect, yeah. QH Freddy writes in, do you think Intel dug themselves into a hole by promising an effectively yearly cadence with incremental increases over the last decade? And now that they are having to make bigger gaps between their releases, it's a struggle for them to justify it to their customers? Or do you think that in this industry, having a consistent release cadence is just necessary for any player to succeed? People like consistency. People like predictability, QH Freddy. It could be every 3 years they double performance, or it could be every year they increase it by 20%. But when you tell people this is when they can buy something and they can't, they get pissed. Intel dug themselves into a hole when the marketing people stopped understanding the progress the engineering people were actually making, made a bunch of claims and promises that they couldn't keep, and then lost all trust of their customers. Doesn't matter what the cadence is, it's that they can't hit any cadence they say.
Well, and when you have a competitor that's also consistently releasing things, you kind of have to keep putting things out to make yourself seem relevant, even if their stuff looks kind of crappy right now. And I mean, I think to an extent these companies, they clearly do, given how close these companies' release windows are to one another. How the other companies' technologies develop clearly influences when things come out too.
Yeah. Good. Freddy writes in, is Intel trying to make people forget that Sapphire Rapids Xeon W exists? This is Fishhawk Falls.
I forgot. I forget about Intel stuff because they have so many freaking code names for everything. But yeah.
I don't know. They said it was launching months ago, and I don't see it on Newegg. Right?
Maybe we'll get it eventually. Who the hell knows?
Remember, guys, Alchemist was on shelves Q1 last year. I don't know. I don't know what anything Intel does anymore. They say something's coming out, it doesn't come out. But let me see. Oh, wait. What is this? 24 core. What architecture is this? Cascade Lake. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know where these things are. But they are not here.
They are on Intel Arc. So they exist in theory.
Yeah. Well, no. I'm saying they have I don't know the names off the top of my head of all of these frickin' Xeons on Newegg. I had to make sure I even knew what architecture it was if it doesn't just tell me. And it was a Cascade Lake one for 1700 if you want that, Dan. Trogaholic writes in and he says, if Raptor Lake refresh requires a new motherboard like 8th, 9th gen CPUs, will it be DOA? Will Intel allow a single motherboard to be used across 3 generations? Well, yeah, it would be dead on arrival, so it won't be. Raptor Lake refresh. I've seen, by the way, people saying online, it might actually be 13th gen. It might. Yeah, it always might have. I just call it the 14900K sometimes because, I don't know, it's more flashing, you know what I mean?
If they
bring a 20% multi-threading increase, they should call it 14th gen.
If they can fully differentiate it from Raptor Lake, even if it is just a refresh of Raptor Lake, they'll call it the 14900K. If not, also, I don't know what else they would call it because they're out of their weird
13990KS.
Yeah, they're out of their naming scheme because they already released the KS.
Yeah, well, and let's be very clear about this. I've seen some people say, Meteor Lake's 14th gen, so Raptor Lake can't be. What the fuck was Comet Lake and Tiger Lake and Rock? Like they did this. They do this all the time. Tiger Lake and Rocket Lake were the same generation. They're both 11th gen, and they were different architectures.
Sometimes people conflate because they usually correlate pretty well, brand and architecture. Some people seem to act like it's a law that the branding has to be the same as the architecture. Because like I remember seeing, this isn't about Intel, this is about AMD's Renoir refreshes, talking people like on Reddit being mad that they were calling it 7000 series, and then a bunch of the comments were just like, "Oh, you learned what rebranding is." It's like, yeah, this has been a thing forever. It will be a thing forever. We can talk about if it's somewhat anti-consumer if you want to. I don't really think it is. It's just brand doesn't equal architecture.
Yeah, and again, this is all semantics. They can call it whatever they want, but it is my opinion that if they can launch a Raptor Lake refresh that is a new edition of the silicon that has 10 to 20% higher multi-threading, 5% less power consumption, maybe a 6.2 gigahertz boost clock compared to what they have now, that would be stupid to call the 13990K. That's kind of a generational uplift, a minor one, but it is. Call it the 14900K. Because they're not launching Meteor Lake to desktop, at least not at that level. And there will be nothing stopping them from then making Meteor Lake on desktop 15th gen or also 14th gen, but a different name. And this is something they do all the time. They're selling Alder Lake CPUs as 13th gen right now. Now, guys. So this doesn't stop anything. It's semantics. And either way, it will use the existing LGA 1700 Trogaholic. Don't worry. All right, 1700? Yeah, 1700. Ufu or UFUFU writes in, do you think part of the reason AMD refuses to release something that beats NVIDIA's Halo products is that they don't think enough people will actually change their decision and buy Radeon? You know how car enthusiasts beg car manufacturers to release a sports car with a manual transmission, but then when they do, no one buys them? Or do they just wait until they're depreciated enough to buy it used, thus not giving the manufacturer a sale? I wonder if AMD thinks this way too. Well, it's kind of a forced analogy, but I see your point. I think AMD designed Navi 31 to hit a certain level of performance and price. They missed that mark by 10 to 20%, and that's that. I mean, I think they wanted it to beat the 4090.
I think if they could have made a card that beat the 4090 and raster by like 5 to 10%, and they could sold that for like $1,200 or $1,300, I think they would have done that.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to put it. Like, I think they would have beaten NVIDIA this generation had things gone the right way. I don't think they attenuated the 7900 XTX, so they made a card that's slightly weaker than what they could have achieved.
Yeah, they're not going, NVIDIA's here, us be here. They wanted to win. I mean, you can say I lied, whatever, but I wasn't lying. AMD thought they were going to win. Also, they thought NVIDIA was going to max out at 400 watts. They didn't think they'd clearly be willing to go to 600 watts, which they were. And so I think AMD saw that actually, the whole performance thing is this whole saga that I cover in another video. Go watch that. But which was the RDNA 4 versus Blackwell, the RTX 5000 strategy video. Check that out, guys. But I think they wanted it to be better than what the 4090 is now. It ended up 20% weaker. And they designed a card they thought they could sell for $1,000 that would compete with NVIDIA's flagship, but they didn't intend it to be weaker. The only thing they missed is that NVIDIA was willing to use 600 watts, and I think they said, well, we're not going to win. And apparently they're willing to go to 600 watts. Let's just make sure this is something we can sell for the price we actually want to. So, is AMD not going to ever make a Halo product because they don't think people will buy it? Absolutely not. They want to win if they can. The only difference is I think they care less about it than NVIDIA, but that's not to say they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
NVIDIA thinks they need to win. AMD would like to. which means they're not going to go balls to the walls to do it. But that doesn't mean they're going to like not try.
Yeah, but it would look stupid if AMD put out a 7900 XTX that used 500 or like 600 watts
600
or something that fell just short of the 4090. I think having something that uses slightly less energy, that uses a bit less energy at stock, because I know it's actually pretty easy to get the 4090 to be power efficient, and beats and loses by whatever, by like 20%. That looks slightly better than having some insanely hot GPU that is loud and at the end of the day kind of sucks, even if it's on paper better.
Right. And I think two more things on this. I kind of hear that AMD, it sounds like they kind of knew the 4080 would be 380 millimeters squared, and then so on and so forth. So they went, oh, well, if 8103 is like 30% smaller than GA103, stands to reason that 8102 will be maybe only 450, 500 millimeters squared. Wrong. NVIDIA still decided to have this die with 60% more CUDA cores, or 80% more? 60 to 80% more than the 103 die. And I did hear that took them slightly off guard. But then in addition to that, this is AMD's first attempt at chiplets. Is your advice as someone in business to go, hey, this could fail because we've never done this before. This is going to be hard. What we're going to do then is make some 500 millimeter squared 5 nanometer die bolted to 8 6 nanometer chiplets for a 512-bit bus. And if it works half as well as expected, our thing costs twice as much to make as NVIDIA? Or are you going to make something where it's kind of almost a mid-range design? That way, if something goes wrong, you can still sell it for a profit. That's what I think they decided to do. And I hear Navi 40 is much more ambitious because they've learned from their first attempt. But if they're not going to decide to not make Navi 40 powerful. Anyone who thinks RDNA 4 isn't going for it again, they're going for it. Mm-hmm. We just don't know yet if they will win, because I kind of estimate that Blackwell is going to be 40 to 60% better than Lovelace at this point. And I think Navi 40 might be 50 to 80% better than what they have now. So, so it's going to be close again, I think. Which, let's be clear, it's close. They're like 20% away from each other, guys. But okay, so that's all of the reader mails, all the stories. You know, no one wrote in about this, but I will just put it on here. What if I do a goofy lighting thing here? Let's see.
Oh, that's perfect.
That's perfect. Everyone will love that. Yeah, but let me do this just for 5 minutes talk about the fact that we've done 200 episodes. I think we mostly plan to celebrate at 256 for 256-bit because we're dorks. But
we could have gone earlier and celebrated 192-bit.
I know, but we missed it because we don't. We're so tunnel vision on just getting an episode out that I just forget milestones.
Well, and 192-bit is a peasant bus width, so.
Yeah, and it's a we should have held the 192nd episode for the 4070 launch date and celebration.
Yes, just not put out 8 episodes for no reason.
But do you have any thoughts, Dan? I mean, we've been doing Broken Silicon since the middle of 2019. That's almost 4 years now.
Yeah, we've gone through a whole ass pandemic.
Whole ass pandemic.
It's weird to think that this, I don't know. The world's changed a lot after 2020, but it's weird to think that we've been doing it for that long, and we've been doing it for the entirety of the existence of COVID and before it. And it doesn't feel like we've been doing it that long, but yeah, I guess we have.
Yeah, I know, it's weird. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's It's shocking, by the way. You go back and like look at like the first time Hardware Unboxed was on, which I don't remember what the views were, but I think there were like 5 to 10,000 or something.
Huh. Well, I guess.
Which the funny thing is, though, is I believe our first episode got like thousands of downloads and 5,000 views total on YouTube, which for a first episode of a podcast is like 10 times what you'd expect. They usually get hundreds at best. You know,
yeah, I mean, it's certainly the first episode was more successful than I would have thought it would have been. And
me too.
It's certainly gotten more successful than I would have ever anticipated.
You know, it's funny though. I just looked around and I was like, there are a lot of people in these WCCF Tech comment sections. Like, someone probably wants a good podcast that talks about leaks and isn't at these companies. I think a lot of the tech podcasts, they're just marketing material for these goddamn companies. They just sit there and bring on Raja Kadori and they're like, oh, Alchemist is going to be good. Okay, thanks. Next segment. But it's like, there's no I just never didn't think there were enough people that were critical, didn't have any skin in the game and getting advertising from Intel, AMD, or NVIDIA, was just willing to sit there and go, hey guys, this thing sucks though, right? Or kind of sounds like this is going to be that in 2 years. But I agree. It's been way more successful than I expected. But in hindsight, I can see why it's been successful. And I do think because me and you too, Dan, put a lot of effort into it. And there's a hunger for this market. It's like there's a hunger for more VRAM and NVIDIA graphics cards.
Well, here's to another 200 episodes. And hopefully when we've doubled the episode count, NVIDIA has more than doubled.
Well, we should stop at 512 for 512-bit and then both hold 290Xs and jump off a bridge. How about that's where we end the show?
The way
512. We got at least another 5 years out of us, I think that means. 6 years. Certainly no one can confirm how you would add up those numbers.
No way to know. I mean, I would say one of us should hold a 290X and the other should hold 8 gigabytes of RAM.
I think that the GTX 280 had 512-bit as well.
Yes.
So you'll hold that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
But until we end ourselves on a bridge holding graphics cards, that's at least 6 years away. Well, at least 5 years away. We will keep doing this episode. And who knows, maybe if you actually got us to 2,000 patrons supporting us, we won't have to jump off the bridge. So remember to support us on Patreon. You would get this early, ad-free, free submissions for questions, free submissions for the upcoming Infinity Ward guest, who you'll also get that early and ad-free next week. Die shrinks, bonus episodes, all of them ad-free, exclusive to patrons, free questions, loose ends. The Discord you'll get access to talk about this with me and the entire community there as well. And we cannot do this without our patrons. We really want to grow it to keep increasing quality this year. So please do that. Support all of our sponsors, like, Silver Knights Fight, CD Key Offers, anyone else who comes on in the next episode or something. And I don't know, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Have a good rest of the week.
And to another almost 4 years.
To another almost 4 years.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugad as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the about/support page. In the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie Nosugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guest questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Full, AV, Anthony Greffa, Greg Pataki, Muhammad Kawari, Brett Jones, Aaron Close, Little Germany, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, Treadbird, Brian Riggleman, Dr. Foreman, Sam Miller, Deke, Josh Lawn, The Mechanical Philosopher, Joe Foot, SNES Chalmers, Tom Bailey, Greg T. Wanchik, Andrew S., Frank Zielinski, Daniel D., MJB1, Eric Jackson, Christopher Croson, Joshua L. Herrera, Valco Malev, The Boss Haas, Nicholas Buckner, Spamton G. Spamton, Jonathan, Lord Starstream, General Drips, Blake, Franco Frederic, Matthew Lazier, Jensen Wang, Nathan Mose, Alex Vega, Gregory S. Ecker, Dominique Koch, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Cameron, VentiCZ, HardForum.com, Original Ross, Slicky, Lance Bassler, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Christopher A. Butler, GZ Ziggy, Star Castro, Stephen Hart, David Sebastian, Mead and Pork, Stu, Tim Robb, Luis Correa, Ian Clifford, Jesse Jess Scowiat, Travis Gooding, Holden Mobley, Nanny and Chris Rich, Deepest Learners, Mad, Zutsu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Michael McGee, Chuck Glidden, Semi Malas, Greg, AWS Danny, Patrick Groh, Invil Chief, Brett Summers, Milton, Stephen Dick, Tommy, John, Brucha, Mark Mitchell, Doug Daffy, AC, James Anderson, Marshall Pierce, Mark Raidmaker, Dave Schultz, 30S Boy 08, Hal Buma, Joseph Madrigal, Matthew Landavazo, Stefan Koladik, Henry Zhang, Jensen N, Keith Moore, The Great Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Joseph Kelly, Earth Taurus, Hexapuma, Chrysantine, Jerome Ferrier, RB Racer, Keith Moore, Michael Cozy, Ben, DNA Tech, Toka, John O'Shea, Royce Meyer, Charles Russell, Reginald Ari, Slushba, Tika Autumn, Jackson Miller, JSMMH, Neith Rizink, Mean Dean, Richard Yao, Andre Jacques, Gaiman Since Reagan, Jeff Sedler, Jordan Simkovic, Loophole 35, Winstar, William Wilpie, James I, Raider, Corey Leonard, Nell Lima, John Shin, Justin Bustle, John Swin, Austin Haggerty, Roger Davies, Shay, Julian Leake, Corey Chappelle, Evan Dingle, C2, John Iverson, Michael Aaron, The Eternal Dreamers, Jansen, Angima, Him, Sagun, Derek Lambing, James Mosher, Kiko Sato, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.